Human interaction between different communities occurs on many levels. While common beliefs and propaganda don't necessarily define every interaction, at its core lies a deeply personal sense of identity that often feeds on hostility. For reasons of security and dominance, individuals feel a strong need to define and belong to a group, the us. This naturally leads to distinguishing and opposing those outside the group, the them. This division isn't usually imposed from above in a conscious way. Instead, it emerges spontaneously and unconsciously within the human mind, often based on visible traits such as skin color, language, clothing, and cultural customs. The subconscious mind struggles to accept differences in others, seeing them as a threat. People feel an inherent need not only to love but also to hate, and the role of the state is to manage and direct both emotions. Long before the concept of the state existed, human communities had already begun crafting myths to rationalize the existence of both us and them. Over time, these foundational myths, all rooted in small subsistence-level agricultural societies, offered individuals a moral framework to process their feelings of affection and hostility. When a complex society eventually arises with a centralized political and economic core and a surrounding periphery, that core simply gives voice to the instincts already present in the wider population. It does not fundamentally change them. This natural tendency toward xenophobia is clearly illustrated in the case of ancient Egypt. Egyptians were highly aware of racial differences. They viewed their own skin as a reddish-brown tone, while they saw Asiatics as lighter and more yellow in color. People from the south were portrayed with darker complexions, deep brown or black, compared to both Egyptians and Asiatics. The word for Nubian, for instance, originally meant burned or bronzed, similar to how the Greeks referred to dark skin. Egyptians also recognized the distinct appearance of Sudanese peoples. Their language was notably different from Egyptian, which Egyptians considered the sacred language of the gods, cherished and longed for even when they traveled abroad. In contrast, foreign languages were seen as meaningless noise, especially the speech of Nubians, who were dismissed as unintelligible babblers. Clothing and appearance further emphasized these differences. Foreigners wore unusual items like shoulder knots, kilts, animal skins, or feathers. Some did not shave, and many carried bows or throwing sticks, all visual markers that separated them from us. The foreign way of life, so visibly different from that of the Egyptians, provoked a wide range of reactions, nearly all of them negative. These responses varied from mild curiosity, which was rare, to fear, disdain, disgust, and even a desire for total destruction. Foreigners were seen as people who didn't know how to live properly, described as hungry, wandering like wild animals. They were often portrayed as thieves and cattle raiders, lacking courage, prone to fear, and inherently untrustworthy. One Egyptian account claimed, "The Nubian only needs to hear a sound to flee. Speak to him, and he retreats. Confront him, and he turns and runs. But if you withdraw, he grows bolder. They are not worthy of respect, they are cowardly wretches. I, the king, have seen this with my own eyes, it is the truth." Even in times of peace, Nubians were viewed as lazy and irresponsible, yet feared for their supposed skills in black magic. Around 1425 BCE, the pharaoh Amenophis II warned his viceroy in the south, "Show no leniency to Nubia. Be cautious of its people and their magicians. Ensure that the peasants' labor dues are collected properly and delivered to the designated official. If there is no such official, report directly to His Majesty. Otherwise, you'll hear complaints like, 'An electrum axe with bronze fittings is missing, the sturdy staff has fallen into a waterhole, and another has been lost in the marsh.' Don't believe their words, and don't involve yourself in their affairs." The region of Kush, associated with Nubia, was typically described in degrading terms such as weak or vile. Nubians were considered doomed from the start. Whenever the Egyptian king led an expedition south of the First Cataract, it was often with a stated goal of defeating and subjugating vile Kush. In battle, Nubians were cast into a deeply derogatory narrative. They were called the god's abomination, deemed fit only to serve as tenants or subjects of Egypt. Their defeats were described in graphic and brutal language. One victory account boasted, "My Majesty slaughtered them in great numbers, both men and women. The valleys were filled with the flayed, and the mountains with the impaled." Another declared, "The Nubian collapses, strangled in the king's grasp. None survive. The Nubian cave dwellers are butchered across their lands, their guts spilling into the valleys, turning them red as if drenched in a storm of blood. Their corpses lay above, swarmed by birds feasting and carrying off the remains. This core attitude toward foreigners remained largely consistent across different regions. Whether dealing with Asiatics, Libyans, or Nubians, Egyptians expressed the same scorn and negative stereotypes, adjusted only slightly depending on the group. The Egyptian worldview was expansive and inclusive in the sense that it placed all peoples, foreign or native, under the rule of Pharaoh, who governed everything beneath the sun. Any action taken by foreigners for their own benefit, even within their own lands, was described by Egyptian sources as rebellion or uprising. Nubians, like other non-Egyptian groups, were classified as part of the St, a term that signified their essential difference. St referred to the arid hilly desert regions in sharp contrast to the fertile Nile Valley. These lands were barren and unproductive, seen as the domain of the desert god Seth, symbolic of sterility and hostility. Although often associated with the idea of chaos, this desert terrain was not considered disordered or random in a literal sense. Rather, it was seen as the opposite of life, hostile to human existence. In the Egyptian imagination, it belonged to a moral realm, not one of mythic or primordial confusion, but of deliberate and active malevolence. Those who came from such lands were thought to embody this hostile nature and thus had to be subdued. Their rightful place in the Egyptian view was beneath Pharaoh's feet, bound and humbled. However, this rigid worldview was somewhat softened in the context of direct, personal interaction. Inside Egypt or in Egyptian-controlled regions, Nubians displayed varying levels of assimilation, and generalizations are difficult across 3,000 years of history. During the Egyptian Empire, in Nubian areas under Egyptian control, it became fashionable for local chiefs to adopt Egyptian customs and behave as refined Egyptian gentlemen. In contrast, ordinary Nubian tribespeople were subjected to strict oversight by Egyptian administrators or intimidation by military forces. Nubians living within Egypt itself often resided in separate districts, although instances of intermarriage and cultural blending were not rare, and may have been quite common in certain periods. During the First Intermediate Period, Nubians lived alongside Egyptians in towns throughout Upper Egypt. Some even recorded their names in hieroglyphs and erected funerary stelae. Nubians who lived in Egyptian communities could access the legal system just like native Egyptians. There were also certain roles within Egyptian society commonly associated with Nubians. These included service in paramilitary police units, who had a reputation for harsh treatment of civilians, and lower-ranking court positions such as fan-bearers. Some also held minor religious roles, and during the 18th dynasty, a few were even appointed as tutors. Still, it is clear from historical records that discrimination against foreigners did exist. Even those born in Egypt to non-Egyptian parents were not always recognized as truly Egyptian. Mastery of the Egyptian language and culture was seen as essential to being considered part of Egyptian society. For example, during the reign of Pepi I around 2325 BCE, a decree forbade Nubians from harvesting crops on lands belonging to the pyramid towns of Snofru or from entering the temple. Nubians who worked within the state system might be subjected to mistreatment, including neglect, denial of benefits, or verbal abuse. One powerful document from the 27th year of Thutmose III's reign, circa 1477 BCE, suggests that foreigners living in Egypt could face legal discrimination, exclusion from palace grounds, and even physical punishment. A particularly striking tomb scene from Memphis, dating to around 1350 BCE, depicts a Nubian prisoner being beaten, a vivid portrayal of the harsh treatment foreigners could receive. In general, all foreigners, including Nubians, were barred from entering the sacred spaces of temples and excluded from participating in religious mysteries. Access to the divine was a privilege reserved for Egyptians alone. However, this attitude changed dramatically when Egyptians found themselves in foreign environments, specifically in autonomous Nubian communities. The earlier xenophobia seems noticeably absent in personal accounts from Egyptians who lived or worked in the independent kingdom of Kush during the 17th and 16th centuries BCE. These Egyptian adventurers, soldiers, officials, and craftsmen, often wrote about their time in Nubia in straightforward, neutral terms, free from a usual derogatory language. One man named Ka described himself as the loyal servant of the ruler of Kush, proudly noting how he washed his feet in the waters of Kush in the service of the ruler Nejken, and returned safely, enriched with goods. Another Sepedher recounted, "I was the brave commandant of Buhan. No other commandant achieved what I did. I built the temple of Horus, lord of Buhan, to the satisfaction of the ruler of Kush." Clearly, the lure of adventure and, more importantly, The promise of wealth outweighed any cultural prejudices these Egyptians may have held. For their part, the Nubian rulers needed capable warriors and skilled builders. In this context, Egyptian and Nubian interests aligned, and mutual benefit replaced hostility. As a result, inflammatory rhetoric lost its purpose and faded away. It would certainly be valuable to understand how the Nubians themselves perceived the racial attitudes expressed by Egypt, and whether they, in turn, held a similar xenophobic disdain toward Egyptians. Unfortunately, this perspective remains elusive. It's highly uncertain whether the Nubians and Kushites of the 3rd and 2nd millennia BCE ever developed a writing system of their own. Most likely, the majority of the population was illiterate and has left no written testimony to speak across the ages. We will likely never know what the young Nubian princesses, brought to the Egyptian court during the 18th dynasty, truly felt. Did they secretly resent Egypt and its people? Or, like the character Ida, did they quietly mourn their homeland with a tearful O patria mea? Among the few Nubians who did adopt the Egyptian language and culture, most presented themselves as loyal Egyptians, as true children of the Black Land and devoted subjects of Pharaoh. It's important not to underestimate the overwhelming allure of a dominant imperial culture. Whether Egyptian, Hellenistic, Roman, or British, the way of life of a victorious empire often exerted a powerful, even irresistible, appeal. Nubian leaders such as Hekenefer or Ruya were not simply imitating Egyptian ways out of convenience. They seemed to have genuinely internalized the belief that to be Egyptian was to become something greater. They saw Egypt as a model of civilization and power, a symbol of superiority. In a striking twist of history, when the kingdom of Kush re-emerged from obscurity in the 8th century BCE and began producing inscriptions in Egyptian, it expressed a profound disdain for Egypt, but one rooted in the belief that Kush, not Egypt, had become the true guardian of authentic Egyptian tradition. Egypt is naturally shielded by a series of distinct geographical boundaries, which deeply shaped the concept of borders in the minds of those who lived there. To the east and west, harsh deserts clearly mark the edge of habitable land with the sharpness and finality of a single dividing line. In the north, the dangerous Mediterranean Sea and the sloping shores of the delta act as a formidable barrier, effectively blocking passage like a physical wall. To the south, although the Nile provides one of the world's most accessible routes for travel, a series of 5 rapids, or cataracts, spread over nearly 1,000 miles makes movement in either direction extremely difficult. Within the floodplain and delta, the intricate network of waterways sharply separates parcels of land, which likely contributed to the later shift in meaning of the word T3S, from simply a plot to the broader sense of a district, defined by its borders. The Egyptian emphasis on boundaries is further reflected in how land ownership and disputes were handled, especially during times of economic trouble or internal conflict. One of the first actions taken after any period of civil unrest was to resurvey property across the country and update or reconstruct the official land registry. In more stable periods, various archives held detailed inventories of land, including farmlands, elevated plots, islands, and every kind of field, each clearly defined and often marked with boundary stele. These markers were sometimes labeled as royal decrees, officially validated by land surveyors. Tampering with or relocating these boundary stones was seen as a serious moral offense, condemned strongly in Egyptian wisdom texts. In some cases, landowners even invoked curses against anyone who might try to move them, underscoring the deep respect Egyptians held for clearly defined borders. For the Egyptians, the idea of a boundary carried with it the promise of security, rooted in permanence and stability. Without stability, there could be no peace. To remain in one place, fixed and unchanging, was to live in harmony, in accordance with Marat, the divine order. Within these boundaries, the settled agricultural community represented the very essence of civilization, believed to have been established by the gods themselves. Families working the land in the towns of their ancestors embodied the moral values favored by both the gods and the king. The notion of leaving their ancestral home rarely crossed their minds. As one saying encouraged, be strong-hearted. Embrace your children, kiss your wife, and tend to your home, there is nothing better.
Prosperweriu arend biburieder.
Outside the boundary, however, lay a realm of danger and disorder. There the nomadic Bedouin lived a harsh, rootless life, always moving, constantly fighting, unable to settle. The boundary represented a clear divide between the God-ordained, stable Egyptian society and the chaotic, lawless wanderers of the wilderness. This line had to be guarded. Fortifications were built, and garrisons established to prevent unauthorized entry. The idea of nomads settling in Egypt's cultivated regions was unacceptable, and efforts were made to stop them. Outposts along the frontier monitored seasonal migrations and blocked attempts to settle. On specific days, some were permitted to pass for trading purposes, but only temporarily. Once their business was done, they had to leave. An inscription from the southern frontier in the late Middle Kingdom, around the mid-19th century BCE, formally recorded these regulations. Boundary established in year 8 under the majesty of the king of Upper and Lower Egypt Kakhauri, given life forever. To prohibit any Nubian from crossing by water or land in a K3I boat, or bringing any livestock across, except for those Nubians who come to trade in Akin or on official missions. These individuals are to be treated well in every respect, but no Nubian K3I boat is ever to pass by He going north. Maintaining the border required determination, consistency, and constant vigilance. It was not a duty for the faint-hearted. King Senwosret III made this clear when he gave a stern warning to future generations. Any son of mine who strengthens this boundary which my majesty has created is truly my son. He was born to me. How excellent is the son who defends his father and fortifies the borders of his lineage. But whoever allows it to be lost, who fails to fight for it, he is not my son, and he was never born to me. While the boundary was primarily designed to control the movement of people from the outside into Egypt's interior, it also served to regulate the flow of goods entering the country. More specifically, it ensured that only the finest or most valuable items were allowed through and that they were directed to their intended destinations. A title such as Overseer of the Restricted Entry Points of Upper Egypt suggests a role dedicated to monitoring what entered Egypt, either through the Nile cataracts or along desert routes leading from the west into Upper Egypt. Many of the imported goods were considered sensitive or confidential, and local officials took great pride in being entrusted with such matters by the royal administration. One common expression of prestige among these officials was the repeated claim, "I was privy to all confidential goods brought through the restricted entry point from the southern foreign lands." Egypt's natural geography granted it well-protected and clearly defined frontiers. The deserts flanking the Nile to the east and west were nearly impossible to cross. Only 3 passes through the eastern desert offered possible transit routes, but all were closely monitored and controlled by the Egyptians. The Wadi Araba, situated north across from the Fayum, provided access to the Red Sea coast and the Sinai beyond. The Wadi Hammamat led to diorite quarries and offered the shortest path to the Red Sea and the land of Punt. Meanwhile, the Wadi Mia served as a gateway to Egypt's gold mines. When nomadic groups from the desert did occasionally reach the Nile Valley, they came only in small numbers that posed little threat. The western desert, though dotted with oases and crossed by a major north-south route, offered very limited access to the Nile. The few potential entry points, through the Fayum, Asiut, or Abydos, were never attractive to large hostile groups seeking to raid or invade. Foreigners most often entered Egypt through 3 main points, along the flanks of the delta and at Elephantine near the First Cataract. While the Mediterranean coastline boasted up to 9 Nile mouths, which may have seemed promising to unaware Asiatic or Greek sailors, in reality, each of these outlets was notoriously difficult to navigate with the sailing technology of the Bronze and Iron Ages. The Egyptians took advantage of this by stationing garrisons at these river mouths and erecting strategically positioned watchtowers, making any seaborne invasion of Lower Egypt nearly impossible. Land-based access from the north was equally restricted. Routes along the North African coast were hemmed in by the vast Sahara and Sinai deserts, narrowing into just a few access points into the delta. In most situations, 1 or 2 well-placed forts were all that was needed to block entry and hold off any unwanted group indefinitely. Although physical remains of such forts from the Old and Middle Kingdoms have yet to be found, records of military titles from those periods clearly confirm their existence. Judging by the forts found in Nubia during the Middle Kingdom and based on depictions in tomb paintings and reliefs, these defensive structures were likely formidable, built with thick mud brick walls, towers, battlements, slope defenses, and sometimes even moats. During times of political instability or reduced military presence, when commanders and garrisons were withdrawn, the border became more vulnerable. Even then, only small groups of nomads occasionally crossed, usually just to water their flocks. Although the 12th dynasty succeeded in extending Egypt's political border as far south as Semna, near the Second Cataract, a boundary that still influences the modern state's southern limit, true Egypt effectively ended at the First Cataract. It was here, in the communities of Aswan and Elephantine, that the Egyptian language and culture reached their southernmost expression. Small in number and geographically isolated within what was essentially a Nile-bound oasis, The people of this region lived a rustic life. Their local dialect was so distinct that it was nearly unintelligible to Egyptians from the north, and tradition even claimed that the constant roar of the cataract had left them partially deaf. Like many settlements in what was known as the head of the south, these towns lacked the wealth or influence to attract top artisans. As a result, their tombs and shrines were typically modest in both design and craftsmanship. Only when the king intervened, providing skilled labor and materials, did structures of truly fine quality emerge. Elephantine's remoteness and limited resources also meant that its local officials held lesser status compared to their northern counterparts. Most of them served as ata, royal appointees who managed estates at the king's discretion. Few rose to the prestigious title of Great Chief of the Township, a rank attained by governors in more prominent cities farther north, such as in the 2nd, 4th, or 6th provinces of Upper Egypt. These local leaders often served the state directly, supervising granite quarrying or leading trade expeditions into Nubia. On occasion, when the king passed through on a southern campaign or journey, he might honor the town with a royal meal sent to the governor or even grant the rare gift of northern servants and a tomb built at state expense, an honor worth boasting about. A governor invited to the royal jubilee might erupt in extravagant praise for the king, delighting in the favor shown to such a distant region. Governor Saranput, a bold figure fond of women and confident in his position, proudly declared that he owed no bow or gesture of submission to any official above him, his authority having been confirmed by the king himself. During times when the central government turned its attention to southern affairs, Elephantine might find itself the focus of royal favor. Yet its isolation also offered advantages. Distant from the capital, ambitious governors sometimes took liberties, engaging in questionable behavior with little fear of being summoned before the broad hall of Horus, Egypt's court of justice. Life on the rocky island was far from easy. The small amount of fertile land limited local food production, so the community relied heavily on supplies brought from the north and on fishing for sustenance. But fishing wasn't just a peaceful pastime. Fishermen also carried the responsibility of keeping the cataract's navigable channel clear and properly dredged. No doubt, the local people looked forward to the arrival of expeditions heading south into Nubia or to the nearby granite quarries. Such visits created a temporary demand for goods and services, providing much-needed income. A similar sense of anticipation likely surrounded the return of military forces from Nubian campaigns, when high-ranking officials gathered at the cataract to welcome the triumphant pharaoh home. Throughout its long history, Egypt's orientation was consistently directed upriver. On any map drawn in pharaonic times that included northeastern Africa, the south would be shown at the top. The word for west, imt, was derived from the Afro-Asiatic root for right hand, and the verb used for moving forward by ship actually meant to sail south. In each Egyptian town, the front was located on its southern side, and the phrase the forward part of the earth referred to the southernmost region of Nubia. This area, therefore, occupied a central place in Egypt's awareness and, especially during the Old Kingdom, was the primary focus of its external ambitions. The outward military expansion initiated by the early kings of the First Dynasty, styled as warlike manifestations of Horus, did not seem to continue during the Second Dynasty. For reasons that remain unclear, Egypt appears to have ceased its attempts to establish authority over non-Egyptian-speaking populations in both Sudan and Asia. The one notable exception was the arid stretch of the Nile between Silsileh and Aswan, a region traditionally known as the Land of the Bow, or Nubia. However, during the early 3rd millennium BCE, this area may have been only sparsely populated, and in any case, the natural barrier of the First Cataract offered a more secure and practical frontier than Silsileh. From that point on, Egypt's objectives were limited to extracting resources from the region south of the cataract. Its strategy shifted accordingly to prioritize access and control. Although the king's cartouches might loom symbolically over the cataract and fortified outposts stood watch at the frontier, a more effective method of asserting power was through armed expeditions, pharaonic march-arounds, or mobile campaigns. These operations not only yielded plunder but also opened up opportunities for trade and the acquisition of slaves, especially when local populations were sufficiently intimidated. Such expeditions often paid for themselves through the goods and captives they returned with. Records that have survived hint at the grand scale of these operations. In one campaign from the 13th or 14th year of King Snefru's reign, it is said that he ravaged the land of the Nubians, capturing 7,000 people and seizing 200,000 head of cattle. Additional graffiti carved on the rocks of Lower Nubia shortly after Snefru's reign describe events such as the arrival of the royal agent for the 17th Upper Egyptian province, Kabaubat, with an army of 20,000, and the devastation of Wawat, and the royal agent for the northern district of the east, Zawibi, capturing 17,000 Nubians. The immediate consequence of these mass raids was the depopulation of Lower Nubia, which is corroborated by archaeological findings. While visual depictions of such captives are rarer, they do appear in art, usually shown serving in Egyptian households and labeled simply as Niziu Nubians, 3 foreigners, or kilt wearers. This last term, previously misinterpreted in older scholarship as interpreters, actually refers to paramilitary groups, possibly used as auxiliary troops or internal security forces, much like the Medjay in the New Kingdom. Nubians were widely respected for their skill in combat, a reputation that endured long after the circumstances that created it had faded. As early as the Old Kingdom, their value as fighters is evident in records of Egyptian military recruitment. When Wayne, the governor of Upper Egypt, was assigned by King Pepe I around 2350 BCE to lead a punitive campaign against the people of Palestine, he assembled forces not only from Upper and Lower Egypt, but also included Nubian soldiers from Urtjet, Medja, Yam, Wawat, and Ka. Even during the First Intermediate Period, when Egypt's control over Nubia significantly declined, Nubians continued to seek service in the Egyptian military. Local governors of Upper Egypt, known as nomarchs, were more than willing to welcome Nubians into their smaller, locally organized militias. Since prehistoric times, the people living along the Nile Valley and in the delta north of the First Cataract had known that many highly valued tropical goods did not originate in Egypt, but came from the lands of the Sudan, or even farther south. For the pre-dynastic period, only occasional archaeological finds offer limited evidence of what southern goods Nilotic communities were able to acquire. However, with the advent of writing, a more detailed picture emerges. It becomes clear that large-scale acquisition of African goods could only be carried out by individuals with access to transportation, manpower, and logistical support. Typically, this meant the king himself. Whether obtained through trade or coercion, these southern products were sent to Memphis and stored in the royal treasury, classified as royal luxury goods. It is not always evident that the goods Egyptians so desired were produced in Nubia itself. In many cases, they were simply passing through, intercepted or exchanged by Egyptians as they traveled northward from deeper regions in Africa. Most of these items were tropical in nature and unavailable anywhere north of the First Cataract. Among the most common imports, from the Old Kingdom through to classical times, were ivory, both raw tusks and crafted pieces, and ebony. In the more detailed records of the New Kingdom, both are shown to have originated in the more distant land of Kush, with ebony appearing roughly 3 times as often as ivory. Panther skins also appear frequently, though less commonly as live animals. Myrrh, incense, and aromatic woods were prized as well, alongside various gums, resins, and spices. Of all the precious materials brought from the south, gold held the highest importance. The Egyptians were aware of its existence in Nubia from an early period, though large-scale mining only began in the New Kingdom. Other sought-after materials included electrum, red jasper, ochre, malachite, hematite, amethyst, a variety of gemstones, and minerals used in cosmetics such as eye paint. Although Nubia was not a primary source of building materials, it did yield diorite stone and wood from the dam palm, which was used in shipbuilding. Surprisingly, given the region's arid appearance today, ancient Nubia also provided livestock, wild animals, birds, and other exotic creatures, many of which were likely brought from sub-Saharan Africa. In addition, it produced agricultural goods that were not entirely overlooked by the Egyptians. It is hardly surprising that, soon after the formation of the Egyptian state, the lands of the Sudanese south came to be seen as a vast reservoir of wealth, flowing northward like an endless bounty. To access these riches, all Egypt needed was a military expedition and a certain degree of cooperation from the local populations. That cooperation, however, often required a display of force to encourage, or compel, compliance. The official titles held by Egyptian officers serving beyond the First Cataract subtly reflect this pressure. Titles such as Seal-bearer of the King of Lower Egypt, courtier, lector-priest, and overseer of aliens often appear alongside governor of the foreign lands for his lord in Yam, Urtjet, and Wawat, or more ominously, the one who strikes fear into the southern foreign lands, and the one who pacifies the southern foreign lands. These phrases make clear that intimidation, or at least a strategic show of power, was a routine part of Egyptian engagement in the region. When local cooperation was interpreted instead as resistance, Egypt responded with coercion, military campaigns designed to enforce submission. The justifications for such actions were often thin and cloaked in moral superiority. Accusations of trespassing, banditry, or cattle theft were frequently used as grounds for mobilizing forces. But in many cases, the records provide no more than vague claims that a certain Nubian group was planning a rebellion. A common literary theme in Egyptian propaganda describes a messenger arriving with ominous news, triggering the pharaoh's growing anger. "What is vile Iram, that they should dare to rebel during the reign of my majesty?" the king might declare. "It is my father Ammonius Re who will bring about their destruction through my majesty's own hand, so that no other foreign land will dare to defy me." Swearing by the sun god, he would proclaim, "As I live, as Re loves me, I will not let a single man of theirs survive. I will bring utter ruin upon them." The pattern of retaliation rarely changed. Two accounts, one by a vizier from the 20th century BCE and another by a viceroy from the 15th century BCE, illustrate the typical nature and results of these military actions. "I slaughtered the Nubians on several occasions in Wawat," recounts Vizier Antifoker. "Then I advanced further south, striking down the Nubian in his own homeland. I returned north after destroying their crops, cutting down the last of their trees, and setting their homes ablaze, exactly as one does to anyone who dares to defy the king." Viceroy Meramos offers a detailed account of a surprise assault on the small settlement of Ibhat. Some days after the harvest began, as the unsuspecting residents of Ibhat were tending their nearby fields, the garrison under Pharaoh's command was mobilized. Troop divisions were organized, and commanders assigned. The campaign stretched from the fort of Baki to the fort of Tarawi, covering a distance of 52 sailing units. In a single day, indeed in a single hour, the powerful arm of Nebmer struck. Cries of despair echoed among the people of Ibhat as the ruler, likened to a lion with piercing eyes, annihilated them at the command of the god Ammonius. It was Ammonius who guided him with strength and ensured his victory. The spoils brought back to his majesty from the land of accursed Ibhat were carefully tallied: 150 living Nubians, 110 warriors, 250 women, 55 servants, and 175 children, totaling 740 captives. In addition, 312 severed hands were counted, bringing the grand total of recorded losses to 1,052. These relatively low numbers of dead and captured reveal the small scale of the targeted communities, undermining the supposed threat often inflated in official rhetoric. The main goal wasn't just the capture of goods or people, it was about sending a brutal message. Entire villages were erased, their livelihoods destroyed, and survivors were often left mutilated or impaled to discourage future defiance. At the same time, such operations offered invaluable experience for Egyptian troops. Nubia served as a proving ground, an excuse to conduct military exercises using real targets. In fact, some inscriptions and reliefs were prepared before the campaigns even began, with space left blank to later insert figures for casualties and captives, if they were ever recorded at all. By the final decades of the 3rd millennium BCE, northeastern Africa and the Levant were undergoing significant upheaval on multiple fronts. In Palestine, the prosperous era marked by large urban centers, classified as early Bronze III by archaeologists, came to an end, as these towns were either abandoned or destroyed. For several centuries afterward, settled life vanished from the region. At the same time, northeastern Africa experienced a notable drop in rainfall and a 30% reduction in the Nile's water volume. Meanwhile, along Egypt's southern border, Nubian tribes began to resist Egyptian exploitation of their land and trade networks. Unlike the 4th and 5th dynasty pharaohs, who had entrusted military and administrative duties in the south to officials from Middle and Lower Egypt, the rulers of the 6th dynasty chose instead to rely on the local elites of Elephantine for handling trade and surveillance. Whether this decision was made for economic reasons or not, it had the effect of placing responsibility for the southern frontier into the hands of those who knew the region best. These march lords were required to travel to Memphis to receive their official commissions and supplies from Pharaoh. Afterward, several routes were available for reaching Nubia. One such route was known as the Road of Elephantine, referring to the Nile path along the west bank starting from Gebel Tingar, directly south of the First Cataract. Although this path may have seemed most logical for someone based in Elephantine, it was not commonly used. Traveling the approximately 600 miles between Memphis and Elephantine involved costly harbor tolls at each stop made by the flotilla, and the difficulty of navigating the cataracts, where carrying boats and goods overland was unavoidable, made the trip even more time-consuming. While Egyptian rulers were rarely concerned about costs, they were highly sensitive to delays. Ironically, a longer but more manageable route existed through the western oases, Bahariya, Farafra, Dakhla, Karga, and Dush, eventually reconnecting with the Nile at Tomas in Nubia. Several starting points were available, but the one leading to the oasis route from Manfalut, north of Asiut, is specifically mentioned in the life story of Kharkov. This earlier version of the later route of 40 days could be traveled on foot with pack animals relatively easily. It is also likely that this was the route used to transport livestock to the royal court in Memphis. However, the leaders who journeyed south during the 6th dynasty did not encounter a peaceful Nubia. Expeditions sent to collect building stone had to be accompanied by warships, while trading caravans required protection from both Egyptian troops and local allies. Civil conflict had erupted, and Egyptian merchants were often forced into the role of mediators between warring factions. In a rare move, Pharaoh Merenra himself traveled to Elephantine to personally receive the allegiance of Nubian chieftains. Suppressing unrest in the region of Wawat demanded the deployment of large military forces, and several tribal leaders, along with their families and followers, were relocated to Memphis. Those suspected of plotting against Egypt, including native chiefs, their retainers, and even some Egyptians who could not be apprehended, were formally cursed through ritual. Archaeological findings from the era suggest that the instability described in the texts was likely triggered by the arrival of new ethnic groups in Lower Nubia. These newcomers were driven from the southwest desert as it gradually became more arid. Among these groups were the early representatives of what archaeologists now call the Sea Group people, a population that prominently included the Medjay tribe, known today as the Beja. For more than 6 centuries following the fall of the Old Kingdom, they would shape the demographics and political dynamics of Nubia. Although they left no written records, their material culture provides a vivid picture of their way of life. The Sea Group people were primarily pastoralists, depending on cattle herding for survival. Their seasonal migrations were dictated by the needs of their livestock, leading them to establish temporary settlements. The animal at the center of their economy was the Bos primigenius, the horned wild ox native to northeastern Africa, which they bred in such a way that the left horn curved forward and downward, a trait still seen today. Most of their dwellings were likely wattle daub huts, though over time, structures with rounded corners and stone foundations also emerged. Their graves were typically shallow and surrounded by a low ring of unworked sandstone nearly a meter high, often accompanied by cattle skulls. The deceased were usually buried in a flexed position on the right side, head to the east and facing west, with occasional offerings of sacrificed sheep placed at their feet. Some burials also included traces of leather clothing. Artifacts found in their tombs indicate that while the Sea Group people made use of local materials, they also maintained active trade connections with both Egypt and regions farther south in Africa. A fragmented yet vivid portrayal of Nasiu and Medjay/Sea Group society emerges from the execration texts, which date from the end of the Old Kingdom through the 12th and 13th dynasties. These records show that the Egyptians were thoroughly familiar with these southern peoples. The texts mention numerous districts and clans led by foreign chieftains, whose names, lineage, and even nicknames are often recorded. Most of these names belong to the language family associated with Nubian dialects. However, a few individuals bore Egyptian names, which is especially noteworthy. Names like Tedionk and Unazonk imply a past relationship as federated allies of Egypt. Furthermore, when a chief was given an Egyptian nickname, it suggests regular and close contact with Egyptians. Occasionally, the texts highlight the wives of these chiefs, and in rare cases, they refer to female chieftains. These leaders commanded groups of strongmen, runners, allies, and henchmen, with such forces sometimes referred to as their personal armies. The primary purpose of the curse formula used in these texts was to preemptively neutralize potential threats. It expressed fears that those named might rebel, plot, or engage in warfare, and it aimed, through ritual incantation, to render them defeated or destroyed. Additional execration texts published later add interesting details to the identities of the cursed Nubians. After noting their maternal descent, the texts sometimes insert further descriptors before listing and his army. In 2 cases, the label is a noun such as calf or bull born of, leading to renderings like who is called calf or bull. In 4 other instances, the added information takes the form of a question or phrase. Examples include, to whom was said, "Are you recalcitrant?" or of whom was said, "Is there a loyal follower of his?" These additions provide insight into Egyptian perceptions of these leaders, their reputations, their stance toward Egypt, and the level of support they commanded locally. The use of interrogative forms and second-person pronouns strongly suggests that these phrases may reflect formal questioning by Egyptian authorities, perhaps part of an official interrogation process. After the death of Pepe II, the central government's power collapsed, ending its long-standing ability to demand goods and services from territories south of the First Cataract. Without Egyptian control, Nubian communities began to flourish independently, and some of their people even moved north, seeking opportunities in Middle and Upper Egypt. Although the kings of Heracleopolis managed to restore some order in the north and were formally recognized across the land, they lacked the strength, or perhaps the will, to prevent these southern incursions. Even within Egypt's borders, their authority didn't extend beyond Abydos. The 7 southernmost districts, from Hu to Elephantine, fell into disorder that not even a royal envoy could fix. The emergence of a powerful family in Thebes, led by Montuhotep the Great, also remembered as the ancestor, changed the situation. This Theban house succeeded in uniting the 7 southern districts under its rule. Soon after, the head of this family, the Lord of Thebes, took on the titles Great Baron of the Southland and Overseer of the restricted foreign entry point, Pillar of the South. As Theban power expanded up to the First Cataract, their influence also reached into Upper Egypt's 7th district. This newly unified region, which would later be known as the 11th dynasty, began asserting its own control over the 180-mile stretch of the Nile Valley and actively resisted attempts by Heracleopolis to reassert authority from the north. Elephantine remained securely under the control of the rebel king Antef II, who recognized not only the military importance of the cataract but also the economic value of its granite quarries. With granite in high demand in the north, Antef may have used it as leverage in dealing with Heracleopolis. As a gesture of respect toward the region, Antef II commissioned the construction of a shrine, the Ku Chapel, dedicated to the local hero and holy man Ib, who had lived about 2 centuries earlier. According to inscriptions from that time, Theban influence extended even further beyond Elephantine and into the western desert, with the treasurer Chetji recording that Antef II and his successor Antef III received tributes not only from Upper and Lower Egypt but also from the desert chieftains. The gradual re-establishment of direct Egyptian control over Nubia began around this period, though it would take many generations to fully achieve. Antef II proudly claimed, "Any army I sailed against, I defeated it completely in one strike. I captured its leaders and its forces." 2 generations later, following the Theban victory in the long war with Heracleopolis, Nebuchadnezzar Montuhotep I was finally able to launch campaigns both north and south of Egypt's traditional borders. Addressing his army, Montuhotep declared, "Let us march north, now that we have subdued the foreign lands. I have granted you all of their sealed treasures, everything your hearts desire." The troops responded with enthusiasm, proclaiming that the foreign leaders had come to him in submission, kissing him in reverence, and that he could now rest peacefully, with both the south and the foreign territories beneath his feet. Montuhotep recounted how he subdued the enemy and incorporated their lands into Upper Egypt. He even reached the shores of the Great Sea, the Mediterranean. He fortified Elephantine and received tribute from foreign chiefs, who came humbly, took sacred oaths, and offered their riches under the weight of forced submission. So thorough was Montuhotep's dominance that Nubia itself became a source of military recruits. A decade after his death, the victor of a brief civil war launched a new regime, the 12th dynasty, fully determined to bring the entire region between the First and Second Cataracts under Egyptian control. Amenemhat, the dynasty's founder, and his successors continually struck Nubia with repeated raids to instill fear and assert authority. One might be tempted to interpret the fortresses as grand displays of royal power, not unlike the lavish mortuary complexes of the Old Kingdom, monuments of symbolic authority, meant more to impress than to serve a practical purpose. However, written records show that the forts were intended to serve very real military functions. Their names, such as repelling the Medjay, curbing the deserts, and subduing the Bao people, clearly indicate their defensive and strategic roles. But their purpose extended well beyond simple military defense. Artifacts and inscriptions found at the sites reveal a wide range of activity. These forts were staffed not only by military personnel, generals, foreign auxiliary commanders, archers, police, and especially retainers, but also by a significant number of civilian officials, both stationed there and passing through. These included district administrators, scribes, labor overseers, engineers, officials in charge of manpower registration, prospectors, and personnel connected to gold production. Even more government representatives passed through the forts, coming from nearly every major department of the state, alongside commercial agents representing temples. Large quarrying expeditions also made use of the forts. For instance, during the reign of Amenemhat II, one such mission consisted of 20 chamberlains, 50 skilled stoneworkers, 200 cutters, over 1,000 laborers, and 1,000 donkeys, all passing by Toshka in search of stone. A state fleet regularly traveled the Nile, stopping at each fort, while a system of couriers maintained communication between the garrisons and central Egypt. Just as with the Asiatic border to the north, the southern frontier was routinely inspected by military patrols, sometimes led by generals and sometimes by civilian officials.
Here is your rewritten text in natural modern English, preserving the original meaning and removing all numbered citations. The extraordinary effort made by the pharaonic government of Egypt's 12th dynasty to occupy and control Nubia cannot be fully explained by the lure of natural resources alone. There was clearly a sense of unease shown by the strong focus on military matters. Many forts near the Second Cataract were strategically placed to respond to and block potential large-scale movements from the south. But was there truly something the Egyptians feared? And where did they believe such a threat might come from? The hymns dedicated to Senwosret III around 1850 BCE reflect both anxiety and relief after he secured the region around the Second Cataract. They praise him as a divine protector of the land, one who expands Egypt's borders and defeats foreign enemies effortlessly. He is described as slaying the Bow people without needing to fight, striking fear into the troglodytes in their own territory and destroying thousands of attackers with overwhelming force. His words alone were enough to drive enemies away, and he is portrayed as a tireless defender of Egypt's borders, allowing his people to rest safely under his protection. However, the events that followed indicate that the threat had not completely disappeared. It began to take shape in the form of a developing local power with native roots, ***. Roughly 130 miles south of the border established by Senwosret III at Semnakama lies the large archaeological site of Kerma, just past the Third Cataract of the Nile. Excavations first carried out by G.A. Reisner in the early 1900s, and later continued by French teams, have shown that from the time of the 12th dynasty until the early New Kingdom, Kerma served as the political and cultural center of a distinct African society. This community had distant cultural ties to the Sigru peoples and stretched from the Second Cataract down to an area south of Nugdumbush in the Dongola region. Based on both its time frame and location, this Kerma culture appears to be what the Egyptians of the time called Kushite, and what their ancestors in the Old Kingdom may have referred to as Yam or Irem. Strategic defense and agricultural potential played a major role in the selection of the site. Located on the east bank of the Nile, Kerma benefited from the natural protection of the nearby cataract and a wide stretch of arid land that acted as a buffer against Egyptian forces to the north. The expansive floodplain provided fertile ground, making the community largely self-sufficient in terms of food. After Egyptian power declined around 1750 BCE, Kerma rose to prominence and became what is considered the first true city in Sudanese history. Spanning more than 60 acres and housing around 2,000 people, the city was protected by mud brick walls 10 meters high, strengthened with stone and surrounded by a defensive ditch. The range in size and design of the mud brick houses and tombs points to a stratified society with clear distinctions in occupation, status, and wealth. At the heart of the city stood major public buildings including a temple, an audience hall, and a palace. The temple was a massive structure of brick, about 18 meters tall, with a staircase and possibly a shrine on top. The enormous circular audience hall and the palace's layout very different from Egyptian architectural styles suggest that the city followed local building traditions. Also deeply rooted in native culture was the significance of cattle and sheep. Livestock were kept within the city limits, and burials often included the sacrifice of sheep and the display of cattle skulls as offerings. At the height of its power, during the 17th and 16th centuries BCE, Kerma's political structure appears to have advanced beyond that of a simple paramount chiefdom. What the rulers of Kerma actually called themselves, or whether their government would meet modern definitions of a state, remains unknown and may not be all that important. Fortunately, we do have a few scattered references to the leader of the Kushite community clearly The authority based in Kerma found in records from Egyptians who served him and even from a king of Egypt's 15th dynasty. These sources use the term Heka, a word commonly used for both tribal chiefs and state rulers. Apophis, a Hyksos king from the 15th dynasty, also used this title in a letter he reportedly sent to the ruler of Kush. Whether that letter is genuine, summarized, or entirely fictional, it reflects how the Kushite leader was perceived at the time. He inherited power through monarchic succession, was referred to using diplomatic terms such as son in a style common in Middle Bronze Age politics, was expected to engage in correspondence possibly in Egyptian with other rulers who viewed themselves as kings, and was seen as a worthy partner for treaties and alliances. All of this supports the idea that Kush or Kerma was regarded as a monarchy rather than a chiefdom by its contemporaries. This interpretation is further supported by the burial practices found at Kerma. Its rulers were laid to rest in grand circular tombs or tumuli, measuring over 85 meters across and rising 3 to 4 meters high. The bodies were placed on beds made from valuable materials, often with headrests and sometimes covered by ox hides. These burials were accompanied by silver crowns, weapons, sandals, fans, food, and even the ritual sacrifice of hundreds of servants to serve the deceased in the afterlife. All of this points to a thriving native civilization that developed its own cultural forms with minimal influence from the outside world. Beyond the reach of pharaonic Egypt, Kerma stands as the earliest known indigenous high culture in Africa. Kerma's rise to power happened at a fortunate moment, just as Egypt was entering a period of political decline. After the death of Amenemhet IV around 1786 BCE, for reasons that remain unclear, the Egyptian monarchy began to weaken significantly. The ruling dynasty collapsed and was followed by a series of short-lived kings, who ruled for only about 25 years in total. These successors were not connected to the 12th dynasty or to each other. Egypt seemed to be sliding into chaos, a situation temporarily stabilized around 1760 BC when Sobkhotep II came to power. He ushered in a brief period of stability, marked by 9 short reigns, the longest lasting just 11 years. But Egypt's internal instability meant that distant provinces like Nubia, which had been annexed earlier, were left increasingly vulnerable. Sensing the shift, Kush appears to have seized its opportunity. Egyptian military presence in Nubia is still evident in the forts until about 1720 BCE, possibly even later, and Nubian leaders continued to appear at the Egyptian court. However, after that, records become scarce and history grows unclear. Fragmentary inscriptions hint at growing tension. A damaged stela from the reign of Sobkhotep IV refers to Wat, an unidentified enemy said to have been struck down in a great miracle. Many Egyptian forts in Lower Nubia show signs of having been burned, and it's highly likely that Kerma was behind these attacks. 2 inscriptions from Karnak dating to the 17th century even hint that Thebes itself faced threats from foreign invaders, though whether these attackers were Nubians or the Hyksos is unclear. What aligns with Kush's expansion beyond the Second Cataract and Egypt's retreat from the region is the discovery of numerous Egyptian artifacts, including statues in Kerma royal tombs. Since these objects appear in a secondary context, it's likely they were looted from Egyptian sites further north. As the Hyksos took over Lower Egypt in the mid-17th century BCE, driving out the last remnants of the Middle Kingdom government and forcing them to retreat south to Thebes, pressure from Kush on Upper Egyptian towns would have only increased. With this loss of territory, the remaining independent Egyptian rulers, now effectively under Hyksos dominance, had to watch as northeastern Africa was divided into 3 separate powers. A century earlier, Egypt had ruled them all. Now, Kerma controlled land as far north as near the First Cataract. It was completely independent, while the Hyksos, after some conflict further south, set their frontier at Kushites in the 14th district of Upper Egypt. These were prosperous and triumphant times for Kush. Its victories were not only marked by the display of captured spoils, but even former Egyptian overlords now came to offer their allegiance. With growing ambitions of imperial power, Kush began to adopt the symbols and practices of the only empire it had previously known, Egypt. Egyptian-style construction techniques started to appear in Kushite architecture. Temples were built with pylons at the entrance, and Egyptian symbols such as the solar disk and the Jed pillar were used as decorative elements. As demonstrated by the Kamos stela, Kush had control over the desert routes that allowed trade with the Hyksos to bypass Thebes entirely. Numerous Hyksos artifacts, such as seal impressions, daggers, and distinctive juglets from Tel Yehudia have been found at Nubian sites and in Kerma itself, underscoring the intensity and success of this trade relationship. In the early 16th century BCE, the weakened and discredited line of rulers from the 13th dynasty, who had remained isolated in Thebes for over 60 years, finally vanished. In their place, a new royal house, Dynasty 17, merged as the dominant power in the Theban region. Although the details of this transition are unclear, it is widely believed that the new ruling family was of Nubian origin. During the dramatic shifts in power throughout the 17th and 16th centuries BCE, not only had Egyptian soldiers entered into the service of the Kushite king, but Nubians had also moved north of the First Cataract to support the small Theban kingdom. Archaeological evidence from this period shows the appearance of a distinctive type of Nubian cemetery in both Nubia and Upper Egypt. These burials, found from the Third Cataract all the way north to Deir Rifa, were made in shallow circular or oval pits dubbed pangraves by early archaeologists. The objects buried with the dead, including pottery and weapons, are entirely Nubian in style. Inscriptions from the 17th dynasty confirm that the Meji-nomadic people from the eastern desert served as scouts and auxiliary troops in the war against the Hyksos. It is very likely that the individuals buried in these pangrave cemeteries were Meji mercenaries. If so, this points to a shared interest between the Egyptians and the Meji, both of whom saw Kerma and Kush in the south as common enemies. The 17th dynasty launched a war of liberation to free the Nile Valley and the Delta from foreign rule, targeting both the Hyksos at Avaris and the Kushites at Kerma. The first military move appears to have been made by Kamos, the third king of the dynasty, in either his first or second year of reign, although an official royal account of the campaign has not been found. Brief references and non-royal inscriptions provide some clues. It seems that Kamos attacked Kush before turning his attention to the Hyksos in the Delta. A letter from Apophis, the Hyksos king, to the ruler of Kush, written during Kamosi's third year, pleads for help, saying, "Do you see what Egypt has done to me? The ruler there, Kamos the Mighty, is pushing me off my land. I haven't done anything to him like what he's done to you." A soldier from Kamosi's army remembered that during the king's third year, he spent every day beating his drum, signaling ongoing warfare. Another man, described as a brave warrior, was rewarded with 46 possessions, likely captives, he was allowed to keep. Though Kamosi's campaign is said to have reached as far south as Miu deep within Kushite territory, there is little evidence that Egypt secured the desert regions along the way. However, Bun, a key fortress, was taken and rebuilt by the end of Kamosi's third year. With the Hyksos expelled, Egypt began its aggressive push southward. Amos, who succeeded Kamos, turned his attention to Nubia and launched a campaign against Kunhen the Fair to defeat the Nubian troglodytes as soon as he had secured the Delta and ended Hyksos rule. A Nubian counterattack, likely led by a commander representing Kerma, attempted to strike back along the Nile but was repelled near one of the cataracts. The enemy leader and his troops were captured roughly 12 years later, during the 7th and 8th years of Amenhotep I's reign. Likely when he reached adulthood, the Egyptians launched another expedition deep into Nubia, south of the Second Cataract. They confronted the forces of Kush in a victorious battle. The Egyptian king personally struck down the Kushite leader in the midst of his army. The Egyptian forces took captives without suffering losses, and fleeing enemies were quickly subdued. Survivors and their livestock were driven into the desert. Egypt now controlled the territory all the way back to the Second Cataract, extending about 80 miles south of the old frontier once established by Senwosret III. Amenhotep I even occupied Sai Island, once a stronghold of Kerma located just 68 miles north of the Kushite capital. By the end of his reign, Kerma, though weakened, still stood, but not for long. Within a decade, Kerma suffered a devastating collapse. Thutmose I, who succeeded Amenhotep I, planned a major military campaign early in his reign. Several inscriptions provide details of this campaign. The old channel at the first cataract was dredged to allow passage, and late in his first year, Thutmose's army crossed into Nubia aboard a fleet of warships. After about a month, they reached the second cataract at Tanger. There, disaster nearly struck at the rapids of Dal, but a naval officer named Amos, son of Abana, saved the fleet by guiding it safely through the treacherous waters known as the Place of Capsizing. He was promptly promoted to commander of the navy. Soon after, the Egyptian force reached Sai and began preparing for battle. The exact time and location where the king of Kush made his final stand remain unknown, though it likely occurred north of Kerma, beyond the official language of the Tombo Stela. Our best account of the battle comes from Amos, the marine commander. According to him, Thutmose I personally led the charge, possibly from his flagship, and struck down the Kushite king with an arrow to the neck in the first moments of the clash. The result was a total rout. Although two of the Kushite kings' sons escaped and continued the fight later, the Kerma regime was finished. The city was destroyed, and its people were taken captive. This decisive victory, later remembered as the Day of the Slaughter of the Perfect God, marks the beginning of Egypt's empire in Africa. To secure the southern frontier at a strategically favorable location, Thutmose I and his army continued their march beyond Dongola, reaching Hagar el-Merwa, just past the fourth cataract, 2 months later. This was a key spot where the overland route from Lower Nubia reconnects with the Nile, making it an ideal location for establishing Egypt's new southern boundary. At Hagar el-Merwa, a rock carving was created showing Amun facing the Horus name of the king. Beneath it, an inscription laid down a formal curse on any Kushite who might dare to cross this new frontier. Roughly 6 weeks after reaching the southern limit, the Egyptian army had returned north to the ruins of Kerma. There, orders were given to construct a fort and to erect a triumphal stela at Tombos, about 7 miles north of the former Kushite capital. Although the stela was inscribed some years later, it commemorated a lasting victory. From that point forward, the kingdom of Kush, once ruled from Kerma, no longer existed. Egyptian control now extended unchallenged throughout the south as far as Hagar el-Merwa, although the reign of Thutmose I is often seen as a turning point in the history of Sudan, his overwhelming victory did not lead to immediate acceptance of Egyptian rule by the native population. For over a century, Egypt faced resistance from scattered and increasingly weakened communities that saw no reason to give up their independence. Right after the fall of the Kerma kingdom, for instance, 2 surviving sons of the Kushite king who had died in battle against Thutmose joined forces with a local chief from northern Kush in an attempt to establish 3 separate regional states. This effort led to raids and harassment targeting Egyptian settlers at a fort Thutmose I had established somewhere in Nubia. Egypt responded quickly and with force, subduing the Nubian communities along the Nile. However, the more distant Sudanese groups continued to resist from within their valleys. A decade later, the Egyptians returned, this time under a young queen known for her strength, courage, and legitimacy. The army advanced over the mountains with horses, launching a campaign in which the rebellious tribes were defeated in great numbers. The operation was so secure and efficient that Hatshepsut herself felt safe enough to walk among the troops and personally bind prisoners. Graffiti found around the Second Cataract, dating between years 12 and 18 of her reign, may indicate continued military action against the final pockets of resistance. This likely concluded in year 20, when her co-regent Thutmose III commissioned a rock inscription at Tombos, celebrating the defeat of the one who rose against him. By the middle of the 5th-10th century BC, less than 100 years After the fall of the Kerma kingdom, Egypt had firmly established a regime of control and stability across Nubia and Kush, reaching as far south as Dongola. All previously independent communities that once acted as middlemen in trade with deeper regions of Sudan had been dismantled. Even before Thutmose I's death, systems were already in place to move goods and people from Sudan to Egypt through taxation or forced service. Ineni, a high official under Thutmose I, describes in his tomb how he witnessed Kushites, captured in war, being delivered as a body of prisoners to the service of the god Amun after the defeat of Kushite. At Deir el-Bahari, the Nubian god Dedwin is portrayed as loyal to the pharaoh, leading Sudanese captives to the Egyptian queen. Similarly, Puemar, the deputy high priest of Amun under Hatshepsut, recalls seeing large quantities of incense, ivory, ebony, electrum, aromatic plants, and living captives, all brought back from military victories. By the 4th decade of Thutmose III's reign, it had become expected protocol for Sudanese chiefs to appear at the Egyptian court, offering tributes just as they had in earlier times. Their offerings included gold, ivory, ebony, giraffes, monkeys, panthers, spices, incense, gems, electrum, and especially gold. While the amounts recorded in Thutmose III's royal annals may appear small, this was only because they represented a specific kind of tax, usually a labor tax, recorded as official entries in the king's daybook. Other surviving sources, such as temple income records, show far greater quantities. One example documents over 36,000 deben of gold alloyed. Egyptian settlements began to appear as far south as Napata, where the local population received royal proclamations and were even treated to public displays and performances. Given how effectively Egypt had imposed this Pax Aegyptiaca, it's difficult to take seriously the repeated claims from later 18th and 19th dynasty kings that certain tribes had suddenly rebelled and threatened chaos if not immediately subdued. Often, such military campaigns seem more like orchestrated spectacles. A messenger would rush in with news of an uprising, the king would enter a shrine to seek divine favor. The fleet would set out in grand style, the crowds would cheer it. It was all part of the performance. Sometimes, the king would appear in full glory in Thebes, standing on a royal platform while his troops assembled in formation. Meanwhile, long lines of people would parade past, offering tributes from the south, the likes of which, it was claimed, had never been seen before. One such campaign in the 5th year of Amenhotep III's reign was immortalized in rock carvings at Aswan and later became the subject of legend. However, the inscriptions that record it are vague, full of exaggerated boasts, and fail to pinpoint where or how the event actually occurred. Many of the campaigns conducted during the later New Kingdom were likely thinly veiled missions to acquire loot and slaves. Thutmose III's expedition in his 50th year may have been little more than a formal inspection tour. Akhenaten launched a military action against a tribe at the junction of the Nile and Wadi Alaki, based on a vague report that the Kushites were taking control of vital supplies. The result was brutal. 80 Kushites were impaled as a warning, and 145 captives were taken as slaves, along with 361 head of cattle. In Horemheb's tomb, rows of subdued black Africans are described as part of the benevolences, the tribute or spoils brought from Sudan. A report that the doomed ones of the land of Irem are considering rebellion was enough to mobilize Seti I's troops. His forces pursued the tribes into the desert, seized their wells, and returned with over 400 slaves. By the time of Ramesses II, dramatic depictions of the pharaoh charging into groups of fleeing Nubians had become a standard. Artistic scene, grand and energetic, but lacking any reference to a specific time or place. **** Inscriptions from Bin allow us to trace a line of fortress commandants spanning 4 or 5 generations, beginning under the Kerma Kushite rule and continuing into the early 18th dynasty. These officials referred to themselves with the general title senior, meaning magistrate or administrator, though some added the more specific title commandant of Ban. In one case, a commandant took on the title king's son, a term that would soon gain wider significance. During the second intermediate period, This designation was often used for royal envoys who weren't of royal blood but held significant authority, often with military roles. During Kamosi's southern campaign, a man named Teddy was appointed as king's son, followed shortly by another named Jaidi, both of whom left inscriptions at Tashka. These individuals are mostly names to us now, but soon a more prominent appointment was made. A scribe of offerings to Amun named Amos So Tayet was tasked with overseeing the administration of Egypt's newly acquired Nubian territories. He held the title king's son along with superintendent of the southern countries, clearly identifying his area of responsibility. His son Turo, who later succeeded him, began his career as a temple scribe, a priestly figure and overseer of Amun's cattle. He eventually became commandant of Bon. This combination of religious and administrative training was common. Many later officials also came from temple service, though a few were trained in the royal palace. From the late 14th century onward, military experience became an acceptable qualification for the role of king's son of the southern countries. Under Amenhotep III, the office was further elevated with the additional title of king's scribe. Although modern historians refer to this position as the viceroy of Kush, it always remained closely tied to the pharaoh. The office holders were typically low-ranking officials who owed their entire status and power to the king's favor. It would be wrong to assume that a complex southern administration emerged immediately following Moses' campaigns. Establishing a functional government in Nubia and Kush was a gradual and improvised process, taking much of a century to develop. During the reigns of the first three kings of the dynasty, the king's son and superintendent of the southern lands held a title with little actual authority, as there was no fully defined territory yet under his control. Only after the final defeat of the Kerma kingdom under Thutmose I and II did the office begin to reach its full potential. Later in the new kingdom, the main duty of the viceroy became overseeing the annual delivery of tribute. However, in the earlier period, others handled this responsibility. One such official was Harmeni, formerly the mayor of Hierakonpolis, who served during the reign of Amenhotep I. At some point, he was placed in charge of Nubia and proudly recalled his years of service. He brought tribute to the pharaoh annually, performed his duties without error, and was trusted by the king. He lived to old age in Nubia, faithfully delivering what was due. This doesn't mean that Harmeni's service predates the creation of the viceroy's office. In the early years, roles and responsibilities were loosely defined and likely overlapped. Significantly, with the reign of Amenhotep III, the office of the Viceroy of Kush reached the height of its development. The viceroy established his headquarters at Aniba and oversaw a vast region stretching from Hierakonpolis in the north to Karoi in the south, covering more than 1,000 miles. His primary responsibilities included overseeing this extensive territory, collecting the annual taxes, and managing gold production. A support network of scribes and household staff developed around the viceroy's residence in Aniba at Kuban, the center of gold production. Additional officials such as supervisors and scribes were stationed. In the tomb of the viceroy, one scene shows people of all ages, both Egyptians and Nubians, bringing gold rings and dust to two officials, the chief of the stable Hate and Hornifer, the scribe of the gold count. The structure of the southern administration mirrored that of Egypt itself. Just as Egypt had two viziers for Upper and Lower Egypt, the southern territories were administered by two deputies, one for Nubia and another for Kushite. Treasury, designated as the treasury of the lord of the two lands in the land of Nubia, was located at Aniba, where a treasurer managed the compilation of tax lists and the coordination of shipments. The administrative system also included departments related to agriculture and livestock, as reflected in titles such as Overseer of the Double Granary, Scribe of the Granary, Overseer of Cattle, and the ever-present bailiffs or local administrators, ****. By the time of the joint reign of Thutmose III and Hatshepsut, Egypt had established a permanent military presence in the Sudan. To support this, Thutmose III constructed a permanent frontier fortress at Napata, located nearly 1,000 miles south of Aswan. In a stela he erected at the site, He mentions receiving lumber from Kush planks of M3 cubic meters wood and limitless quantities of furniture made from southern acacia harvested in great numbers by his troops stationed there. Hatshepsut is the first ruler to refer to a standing army in Kush, a term that would later become standard for Egyptian occupation forces south of the First Cataract. Modeled after similar military structures in Asia and mainland Egypt, the garrison was organized with a commanding officer, battalion leaders, quartermasters, and army scribes. Garrison duty was never considered desirable, and service in the hot southern regions was especially unpopular. It was viewed as a form of punishment or exile. Soldiers were settled in small villages along the Nile and could be mobilized at any time. These troops were often grouped by village into quick response units. Initially, the garrison in Nubia was tasked with maintaining control over the Sudan, enforcing order, and launching punitive missions when necessary. However, by the end of the 19th dynasty, this military force had grown increasingly autonomous, becoming unruly and unpredictable. Incidents of unrest in places like Erem and Akita, along with the violence that required retaliation under Merenta, may point to deeper instability within Nubian society. It's unclear whether the Kushite garrison was directly involved in the civil strife that marred the end of Merenta's rule, but it was certainly implicated in the plot to assassinate Ramesses III. Later, members of the garrison were involved in tomb robberies. 70 years afterward, as will be discussed later, the garrison once again inserted itself into Egypt's political affairs, this time attempting to claim ultimate authority. It is evident from the structure of the viceroy's civil administration and the organization of Egypt's military presence that Egyptian systems served as the model for everything in the south, from the reign of Amenhotep III and even earlier. In some cases, inscriptions refer to towns, villages, and forts governed by officials titled Hadia, mayor, following long-established Egyptian customs. The use of the word township indicates that the Egyptian idea of a city and its surrounding lands had taken root in Nubia. Many of these settlements, including newly established towns and rebuilt forts from the Middle Kingdom, were centered around temples. These temples supported the economy and justified the concentration of large labor forces in specific locations. Many of these new towns were also enclosed by walls. The demographic makeup of these southern settlements and the relationship between Egyptians and the native population remain topics of scholarly debate. To what degree did the native Nubians adopt Egyptian culture? And how many of the inhabitants during Egypt's imperial peak were actually Egyptian colonists? Archaeological evidence shows that while the latest group burials dating to the early 18th dynasty remained rich in native style, changes gradually appeared from Hatshepsut's reign onward, indicating a growing adoption of Egyptian customs and burial practices. Some native leaders began using Egyptian names or married into Egyptian families, but their descendants did not continue to hold power. The expansion of the Egyptian empire brought with it an imposed administration that left little room for local control. Nubians had no special status in this system, and local independence was rare. The south was reorganized under what was essentially a plantation economy. Prime agricultural land was seized for the benefit of the crown, temples, or elite officials. Egyptian colonists were introduced as civil servants and farmers. Prisoners of war from Canaan were used to work the fields and serve as unskilled labor for the temples. Most of the region's agricultural output was shipped to Egypt, with only basic provisions left behind to sustain operations. A decree issued near the end of the 14th century BC gives a detailed look at the types of people living in or passing through Nubia and Kush, as well as those under their control. Their primary responsibilities included gold mining, tax collection, forced population transfers, labor service, and agricultural work. Besides the viceroy and his administrative team, the list is heavily dominated by military roles. Commanders, charioteers, stable managers, officers, fort commandants, and regular soldiers. The civilian roles mentioned include mayors, village leaders, agents, and overseers of Nubians, a title that suggests an isolated, controlled native population. In summary, During the Egyptian Empire's rule, a powerful Egyptian minority comprising military, administrative, and civilian officials exercised complete control over a much larger native population. Some native elites, particularly families of former chiefs, adopted Egyptian customs to varying degrees. But overall, the native Nubians were pushed into a subordinate, servile role, stripped of any real influence in the governance of their own land, **** Egypt's ambitions in the south to expand its borders, exploit resources, and reduce the local population to servitude are perhaps most clearly seen in the religious sphere. In this realm, Egypt thoroughly overpowered native traditions. Whatever forms of worship or local religious practices existed in the Sudan before the New Kingdom, most did not survive the Egyptian occupation. Falcon cults, which were widespread in Nubia, might have represented local deities, but it's more likely they were versions of Horus the Egyptian king who was often called Lord of Foreign Lands and brought to these regions by the Egyptians. Similar reinterpretations likely applied to other gods, such as Thoth, whose symbols appear linked with Thutmose III and Amenophis. As Egyptian settlers moved south, they brought their deities with them, particularly those associated with the Nile's cataracts in Upper Egypt. In keeping with Egyptian religious customs, the female goddess also gained prominence in the region under the title Hathor, Mistress of Wat. However, the most important religious institutions during the New Kingdom were the temples dedicated to the pharaohs themselves. As soon as Egypt re-established control in the south, shrines honoring the divine kingship began to appear first in settlements revived from the Middle Kingdom and later in newly established towns. These temples served dual purposes. They provided places of worship for both Egyptian settlers and local inhabitants, and they acted as bold architectural declarations asserting the pharaoh's legitimacy as ruler of Nubia. Most of these temples were built during the 18th dynasty, starting aggressively under Thutmose III and continuing through the reigns of Amenophis II, Amenophis III, Akhenaten, and Tutankhamun. Even during the 19th dynasty, when Egypt was no longer founding, new colonies in the South Temple construction remained intense. Ramesses II alone built at least 10 temples south of the First Cataract. The specific economic role of these temples in Nubian life remains unclear. Were they self-sufficient estates with landholdings? If so, were these lands in Nubia, Egypt, or both? Did the temples receive their own endowments? The use of the phrase "in the house of Amun-Re" in connection with Nubian temples during the Ramesside period implies that these may have functioned as satellite branches of larger temples in Egypt. However, this theory is complicated by the fact that Nubian temples are almost entirely absent from Egyptian administrative records. Recent approaches to interpreting the expansion of the 18th dynasty and beyond have led to a wave of ideas, some quite clever, that are starting to shape assumptions the original scholars may not have intended. These include applying modern economic and state theory terms to understand ancient empires, suggesting that ancient rulers engaged in long-term strategic planning, understood production costs, and sought efficiency, as reflected in how goods were distributed in outlying regions. Arguing that resources from Africa, such as gold, were used to finance state functions elsewhere in the empire. Each of these ideas deserves careful scrutiny. It has become somewhat fashionable among Egyptologists to treat the ancient Egyptians as rational economic thinkers, what we might call homo economicus, similar to how we view ourselves today. This trend encourages the use of modern economic theories like rational expectations to analyze ancient behavior. However, imposing such concepts on ancient societies can be misleading, especially since many of these modern ideas are already under debate among today's economists. More importantly, this approach risks ignoring what the ancient Egyptians actually expressed in their own writings. Their records show that ideologies such as asserting power, avenging wrongs, and defending honor mattered far more than economic considerations, particularly during the early phases of empire building. None of the ancient sources show any sign of concern for gaining resources, controlling trade routes, or replacing middlemen. Instead, Egypt's rulers described military campaigns as responses to aggression, efforts to punish enemies, or actions taken to protect the realm. The dominant message in these texts is not economic gain, but the need to ensure the safety and supremacy of Egypt. The typical disorder and instability associated with non-Egyptians were seen as direct threats to Egypt's security. Pharaoh struck, first against Kush to eliminate unrest across foreign lands and to prevent invasions from abroad. The Nubians had to be subdued because they were suspected of planning uprisings against Egypt. These acts of resistance were often labeled as rebellion, especially when Egyptian settlers were attacked, their livestock seized, and their lands confiscated. In many early 18th dynasty inscriptions, Egypt is portrayed as a vulnerable figure like a mother who expects loyalty from her children, yet needs a heroic male protector. Kamose set out to rescue Egypt, whom the Asiatics had ruined, while Thutmose III is hailed as the savior of Egypt fighting in the breach. Even Thutmose I recognized this role, claiming he empowered those who had been afraid, removed evil from Egypt, and made her a ruler with all other lands as her possessions. One of the clearest expressions of Egyptian imperial ideology is found on a stela of Thutmose III from Buto. It declares, "The southerners are in his grasp, the northerners under his command. All lands and foreign nations tremble before him, lying prostrate beneath his feet. Foreign rulers bow their heads and cry out, 'He is our master!' They serve him out of fear. There is no land he hasn't entered to extend Egypt's power. Myriads mean nothing to him. He is a king who single-handedly slaughters nomads in battle. He compels the chiefs of retinue to deliver their labor taxes, submitting like servants of his palace. He achieves more than an army of millions behind him, a peerless warrior unmatched by any king or general, whether from the south or the north. He deserves praise equal to his strength. Since he took the throne, Egypt fears no other land. She no longer bows to the south or pleads with the north, trusting in her champion like the god Min, his arm raised in victory, the king of Upper and Lower Egypt, Menkhepper, archer of Montu, who extends his frontier to the edges of the earth, to the highlands of Miu. Kush serves him as a vassal, sending endless tributes of gold, ivory, and ebony. No king, past or present, has matched his deeds. This statement captures the essence of Egypt's imperial outlook: divine approval of the king, overwhelming military dominance, global intimidation, the feminized image of Egypt as in need of protection, and the king's noble role as her defender. There is no room here for the modern logic of economic planning or cost efficiency. In simple terms, Egypt expanded its borders as a means of defense, and the conquered peoples, like Egypt's own peasant class, were reduced to tenant farmers whose land, labor, and produce were subject to pharaohs. It is difficult to reconcile the idea of long-term planning and deliberate policy with the actual evidence from the pharaohs themselves. At nearly every stage, we encounter a certain impulsive or improvisational character, poorly suited for long-term strategic goals and more inclined toward on-the-spot decision-making. Kamose might declare his intentions or desires. Amenalphis II might give a brief account of his attitude toward the Nubians, or Akhenaten might share his opinions about Canaan, but none of this amounts to what we would consider a coherent government policy in the modern sense. The suggestion that the spread of Egyptian or Egyptian-style artifacts in the outer regions reflects a deliberate policy from the central government is hard to support. This view overlooks the clear lack of concern among Egyptian officials regarding where goods ultimately ended up. It also tends to ignore any serious analysis of how towns and settlements were classified and spatially organized. In trying to evaluate how an imperial center influenced its peripheral settlements, one must consider the hierarchy that the center imposed. In any empire, the central authority has the power to promote, support, or neglect certain towns, and that directly affects what kinds of objects or remains might be found there. It's important to remember that Egypt referred to all the settlements under its rule simply as towns of Pharaoh, denying them any independent metropolitan status. Only two general categories of settlements were used to towns and hamlets. And there was an unspoken ranking system for these settlements, ranging from administrative headquarters and garrison towns to name-based towns, supply depots, and rest stops like water stations. It would be worth exploring how the distribution of Egyptian or Egyptian-influenced artifacts corresponds to these different settlement categories. During the New Kingdom, the means and likely the exclusive right to export Egyptian goods and artifacts on a large scale belonged to a small group of powerful figures, the king himself, the vizier, the chief treasurer, and the heads of a few major temples. These state-run caravans and expeditions weren't primarily about trade in the modern sense. Their goal was usually to extract or demand specific items from smaller foreign communities, more a form of targeted acquisition or gift exchange at a high political level. Because of this, true private enterprise or entrepreneurial trade was largely absent from the Egyptian imperial system. For those in power with virtually unlimited authority, cost was of little concern. Expeditions to the Sudan, for instance, could involve hundreds of donkeys traveling the long and difficult desert routes rather than the more efficient river path regardless of the expense. Tens of thousands of people might be uprooted and exiled to distant regions at an enormous cost that no frugal government would tolerate. Armies of 10,000 men might be dispatched to extract a few blocks of stone that a few hundred workers could have handled more efficiently. Once again, as with the building of the pyramids, the pharaonic state engaged in grand, extravagant gestures not to maximize utility, but to showcase the boundless power of the god-king. It was about cultivating an image of divine might and heroism, not efficiency or restraint, both in appearance and in intent. Some have attempted to describe Egypt's conquest of Nubia's mineral resources as part of a financial strategy designed to fund Egypt's global ambitions. While the model may offer some insights, describing it as a form of finance is misleading. The term originates from monetary economy systems where money facilitates transactions and helps secure goods or services from various sources. But Egypt's centralized, monopolistic system functioned entirely differently. There is no clear evidence that the influx of mineral wealth from Nubia directly supported Egypt's political or military influence abroad. It is not necessary to assume that southern gold was what enabled Egypt to expand or maintain its empire. As far back as the Old Kingdom, Egypt exerted influence into the Aegean without relying on Nubian gold. And during the New Kingdom, Nubia was subdued long before its gold mines reached full productivity. The Asiatic Empire, too, was not built on wealth extracted from the south. Egyptian campaigns in Asia were often carried out by modest forces composed of conscripts and laborers drawn from temple estates. These troops, far from being highly equipped or well-financed, often relied on food and supplies produced locally in Egypt. Their rations were grown along the Nile and transported to the front lines. In this way, the expeditionary forces of the New Kingdom operated much like those of the Old Kingdom, mainly launching raids and slave-taking expeditions. Long before Nubia's economic value was significant, for at least the first century and a half of Egyptian control over Canaan, the cost of occupation was borne by the local populations. Only during the Egypto-Hittite conflicts in the 13th century did this model begin to shift. Most of the precious metals acquired from Nubia flowed into Pharaoh's treasury or temple treasuries. Although the temples grew enormously wealthy, their holdings were still firmly controlled by the state and remained part of the broader pharaonic system. The main goal of the Egyptian state throughout its history was accumulation, not circulation or redistribution. While a limited amount of gold and silver may have been used in trade, both domestically and internationally, the vast majority of it was simply held as reserve rather than actively spent, one real but often overlooked use of Egypt's increased wealth in precious metals was its application within a system of loyalty and reward, known as FQ3. This should not be confused with formal state salaries or official compensation. This loyalty-based reward system primarily operated within the Egyptian population rather than in dealings with foreign groups. Certainly, the pharaoh might offer small tokens or gifts to foreigners who were present on His Majesty's waters, But such gestures had been part of Egyptian practice since the Old Kingdom long before significant quantities of gold from Nubia became available. While Nubian gold may have appeared to be a new incentive to present to foreign rulers, it was far from essential to Egypt's foreign relations. In truth, such rewards represented only a small portion of Egypt's total resources and had little impact on the broader framework of state policy. There is no continuous historical account of how Egypt lost control over its provinces in Kush and Nubia, but scattered clues occasionally appear in side notes within business and administrative documents. The last known viceroy who held real authority was Panesy, whose term seems to have lasted roughly through the first 2 decades of Ramesses XI's reign. His career appeared typical. He built a tomb for himself at the viceregal center in Aniba, as was customary, and his name also appears in religious texts at Bun. However, by the 12th year of Ramesses XI's rule, Panesy's name unexpectedly shows up in a routine document from the Thebaid, dealing with grain receipts from local farms. In that record, he is given a grand list of titles: standard-bearer at the king's right hand, royal scribe and army general, overseer of Pharaoh's granaries, king's son of Kush, and superintendent of the southern lands, the commander Panesy of Pharaoh's battalions. This strongly suggests that Panesy was either present in Thebes or overseeing its administration at the time. The question then arises, what caused his authority to suddenly reach into Upper Egypt? Panesy's time in office coincided with the final years of Amenalphis, the high priest of Amun. Amenalphis was the son of Ramesses Nakht, a former high priest who had served under Ramesses III around 70 years earlier. Ramesses Nakht appears to have secured the ability to pass his position on to his sons, a right previously held by the king. Amenalphis is first mentioned during the 10th year of Ramesses IX's reign, receiving honors for the many impressive monuments he had built for the Temple of Amun and for his effective handling of harvest taxes, dues, and labor contributions from temple staff. These accomplishments must have taken some time to complete, suggesting that Amenalphis began his duties well before the 10th year. Whether he continued in office under later kings is uncertain, though it seems likely that he did, later in life. Amenalphis described a troubling episode in which someone, clearly an adversary, seized what seems to have been the temple of Amun and held it for 8 full months, during which Amenalphis suffered greatly. Eventually, he prevailed over this enemy and appealed to the pharaoh for justice. This incident is almost certainly the same as one reflected in the court records from the trial of a gang of thieves during the 19th and 20th years of Ramesses Shi. The crimes included grave robbery and the theft of precious metals from portable shrines and temple doors, brazen acts that could only happen in a time of lawlessness. These offenses had occurred long before the trial. Many witnesses were children when the events took place and were adults by the time they testified. One testimony reads, "The barbarians came and took control of the temple, Medinet Habu, while I was tending my father's donkeys. One of them, named Pehat, captured me and brought me to Epip, just as the violation of Amenalphis, then high priest of Amun, was reaching its 6th month. I only returned after the shrine had been stolen and set on fire, 9 months into the crisis that Amenalphis endured. The attackers came in large numbers." One witness recalled, "When I was a little boy, my father was killed. My mother told me that when the barbarian commanders killed him, they also took her for questioning." Panesy was directly implicated in the events. Another deposition stated, "I left the pharaoh's palace just as Panesy came and violated my master, though my master had committed no offense." Panesy's name appears elsewhere in relation to crimes committed in Thebes, including unlawful seizures and even murder. A strong argument has long been made that Panesy, the viceroy, led an occupation of the Thebaid, displacing the high priest by force, likely with the support of Kushite troops often referred to as barbarians. This occupation was described as a violation, a term that originally meant to cross a boundary or trespass, and later came to imply acts of damage, defiance, or disobedience. At one point, the conflict is even called the War of the High Priest, suggesting it may be connected to other events like Panesy's reported destruction of Hardeian references to warfare in northern Egypt, Lower Egypt, although partly drawn from legend. A text known as Papyrus Pushkin 127, written near the end of the 20th dynasty, speaks of the flames of war consuming all directions of the land. While this interpretation remains speculative, the motivations of those involved are even harder to determine. Was Panezi truly the aggressor and Amenophis the victim? Or did Pharaoh have a role in this power struggle, perhaps inviting Panezi to intervene in response to unrest, or possibly supporting Amenophis against Panezi as one reading of a biographical account suggests? And who truly sparked the conflict, Panezi, Amenophis, or another unknown figure? Earlier scholars believe that Amenophis's time in office marked a final attempt by the high priesthood, now wielding authority on par with the monarchy to seize control of the state from Pharaoh. While some contemporary texts show the high priest acting with arrogance, overriding official orders and denying rations to workers, these could simply reflect isolated incidents. In fact, the biographical statement published by Wendt depicts its author as a loyal servant of the king, more victim than villain. Given the limited sources, the following reconstruction offers a plausible sequence of events. Early in Ramesses XI's reign, a civil war broke out for unknown reasons. It lasted nearly a year and brought widespread looting and violence. Panezi entered the Thebaid with Nubian forces, removed Amenophis from power, and temporarily took control. Not long after, Amenophis was somehow reinstated but died soon thereafter. His immediate successor is not known. Panezi remained in control of the Thebaid until at least year 12 of Ramesses XI's reign, and possibly longer. He was still part of the royal administration in year 17. At this point, a new figure emerged, Herihor, likely of military background, who suddenly appears in Thebes as the high priest of Amun, carrying an impressive collection of titles: heir, apparent, overseer of the two lands, great courtier across the entire country, field marshal of Upper and Lower Egypt, commander, superintendent of royal construction, administrator of Upper and Lower Egypt, overseer of granaries and vizier. Panezi is no longer mentioned. Herihor had clearly become the pharaoh's trusted official, and even assumed the title Viceroy of Kush without hesitation. In year 19 of Ramesses XI's reign, likely following a divine oracle, the god Amun issued a proclamation appointing Herihor as governor in Thebes, while a man from the north, Smens, was named as officer in Lower Egypt. Whether these appointments were sanctioned by the king or carried out independently is unclear. Though contemporary accounts depict Ramesses XI as a largely powerless figure, he continued to visit Thebes for major religious festivals, and his authority was still acknowledged. Nevertheless, year 19 marked a clear departure from earlier times. A new era had begun, referred to by those living through it as the Renaissance. From this point forward, official dates used both the king's regnal years and the new era's calendar. In his daily role, Herihor maintained the title of High Priest of Amun, which served as the basis for his administrative authority. Among the people, he was casually referred to as boss or magnate. But within the sacred space of the temple, where tradition required the presence of a pharaoh to conduct rituals, Herihor took on the role himself, adopting full royal titulary and acting as king. By this time, the province of Kush had effectively ceased to exist. If Panezi's intervention in Egypt had been an attempt to seize power, it ultimately failed. Herihor's new regime allowed no rivals. Panezi was last reported fighting against Herihor's successor in Nubia near the end of Ramesses XI's reign. After that, he disappears entirely from the historical record. By the start of the first millennium BC, the southern regions had entered a dark age. Although Herihor and his successors may have continued to use the title Viceroy of Kush to assert their claim over the former Sudanese province, this claim became increasingly symbolic and disconnected from reality. By the end of the 20th dynasty, if not earlier, inscriptions in the temples of Nubia cease, and evidence of any functioning administration vanishes. The last known texts at Kawa are linked to the Viceroy Namaranik during the reigns of Ramesses VI and VII at Bonn. The latest inscriptions date to the time of Ramesses XI, and temple rituals at Napata appear to have ended under Ramesses. 9. The last record of taxes collected from Kush appears late in Ramesses XI's reign. In year 23. Our view of the region fades completely after Piankhy's campaign against the rebellious Viceroy Panesi. For several centuries, we are left with almost no archaeological evidence. This coincided with a period of low Nile floods, which led to famine in the Thebaid and forced communities in Lower Nubia to abandon their homes and migrate south to the Dongola region. During Egypt's imperial era, the prosperity of Lower Nubia had depended heavily on trade with Egypt. As Egypt declined economically and depopulation followed, the trade networks broke down, dealing a severe blow to Sudan. Both Egyptians and Egyptianized Nubians disappeared from the region, and the vibrant cultural life that once flourished vanished. The once grand temples built during the 18th and 19th dynasties were left deserted, and crumbling, haunting reminders of a glorious past that would never return. The first signs of renewed prosperity in northern Sudan can be traced back to the early and mid-9th century BC, when evidence begins to point to a developing community around Napata. This site, located beneath Gebel Barkal, had once supported an Egyptian presence dating as far back as the reign of Thutmose III. The worship of Amun, the divine protector of the empire, had been established there, and a modest shrine built by the time of Tutankhamun had by then been expanded into a formal temple. Over time, the cult of Amun held a powerful appeal for the native Kushites. They embraced it as their own and began to settle in Napata, forming a permanent community. Around 890 BC, their burial site at nearby Kuru began to yield a series of large graves. The earliest of these followed native traditions. The tombs consisted of a pit and chamber beneath a simple mound, and the deceased was either placed in a crouched position or laid on a bed. Later developments saw the mounds faced with stone and the construction of mastabas, reflecting Egyptian architectural influence. At the same time, trade began to flourish once more. The Theban high priest Osorkon, in the 24th year of Tefnakht II of the 22nd dynasty, mentioned receiving fine gold of Kenhen the Fair and high quality, dry myrrh from the land of Naasi among offerings to Amen. These references align with the appearance of Egyptian trade goods in the Kuru tombs. But who were the people buried at Kuru? And what was the ethnic makeup of the Napatan community they led? For a time, speculation ran wild. Some suggested that priests of Amun had fled Thebes after the fall of the New Kingdom and established a theocracy in Napata. Others claimed that a man named Pashadbast, said to be a son of Pharaoh Shashank, had settled there and founded the Kushite royal line. However, there is virtually no evidence to support either theory. The worship of Amun at Napata had deep roots, and the jar bearing Pashadbast's name was clearly a trade object. Judging by their later depictions and names, the founding members of the 25th dynasty appeared to have been an indigenous family of Black Sudanese origin, likely leaders of local tribes in the Dongola region. None of their birth names come from the traditional Egyptian name lists, and in colored artwork, their skin is shown as a deep chocolate brown, distinct from the lighter reddish-brown tone used for Egyptians. Their system of royal succession also differed from Egyptian norms. In Napatan tradition, the throne passed through the king's sisters, first from elder to younger brother, then to the eldest brother's son, the family of leaders buried at Kuru, likely the ruling class of what began as a chieftain mentors. The historical record around 5 generations after the cemetery's founding, with a man named Alara, the first to be known by name. Notably, when this emerging chiefdom decided to adopt a writing system, it chose Egyptian hieroglyphs. Though the local Nubian dialect remained the everyday spoken language, the rulers of the 25th dynasty used only Egyptian for official inscriptions such as triumphal stele in public records. Indeed, the cultural framework of early Napatan society was heavily influenced by Egypt. Alara, by enclosing his name in a cartouche, clearly saw himself in the image of a pharaoh. When he and his successors sought to immortalize themselves in sculptures and reliefs, they turned to what was readily available, the Ramesside temples of Nubia. These temples, with their distinctive artistic styles, became templates for Kushite Art. Later, when the Kushites gained control of the Thebaid, the dynasty embraced the traditional, bold artistic style of Thebes marked by deep reliefs, powerful physiques, and prominent facial features, but more than art or language, it was the worship of Amun that truly captivated the Kushites and bound them spiritually to Thebes for over 2 centuries. Their political and religious power was centered at Napata, beneath the sacred peak known as the Holy Mountain, where Amun was worshipped in his local form as a ram deity. The kings of the 25th dynasty revered Amun with passionate devotion. To them, Amun alone could create a legitimate king. They saw themselves as his children and chosen ones. The Kushite monarchs closely identified with Amun in their royal imagery, and from the time of Alara they began dedicating their sisters and daughters to the god's service. Long before political ambitions came into play, the rulers of Kush likely yearned for Thebes with the same intensity that a medieval crusader longed for Jerusalem. Unfortunately, the early 8th century BC remains largely silent in the historical record, but it must have been during this time that the young Nubian kingdom was actively adopting and adapting pharaonic traditions that would go on to define the Sudanese civilization of the 25th dynasty. Alongside the Egyptian script and language, introduced perhaps by scribes brought from Egypt, came a range of technical knowledge vital to the South's eventual rise to power. By sometime before 750 BC, the Napatan kingdom had acquired advanced military technology, chariots, body armor, weapons, and most notably, siege techniques involving towers, ramps, and battering rams. These developments suggest awareness of innovations originating in Mesopotamia, likely transmitted through intermediaries in the Levant or Egypt. In this way, by the time the Kushite rulers emerged onto the world stage, they were prepared to challenge even the most powerful empires of the time. Alara was succeeded before the middle of the 8th century BC by his younger brother Kashta. Inscriptions bearing Kashta's name have been found at Elephantine, suggesting that his influence extended at least as far north as the First Cataract. With Kashta, the histories of Kush and Thebes begin to intertwine. If the Kushites had hoped to be welcomed by a unified Egypt devoted to the worship of a shared national god, they were likely deeply disappointed. The Egypt they encountered was nothing like the powerful new kingdom of 6 centuries earlier. A foreign ethnic group had not only entered the Nile Valley, but had also taken control of the country. Egypt's resistance in the 12th century BC to waves of population movement from Libya and the Aegean met with only partial success. 3. Major battles fought during the 5th, 8th, and 11th years of Ramesses III. In the early 12th century BC, managed to stop the unchecked advance of these foreigners into Lower Egypt, but only just. These efforts were massive and left Egypt drained and weakened. Compounding the crisis were falling Nile floods and internal conflict within the royal family of the 20th dynasty, which further damaged the economy and undermined the state's ability to guard its borders. Throughout the late 12th and early 11th centuries, Egypt gradually lost control of its Asiatic and African territories. It was even forced to tolerate the settlement of the very Aegean groups that had once tried to invade, now establishing themselves at the doorstep of the eastern delta, particularly in southern Palestine. In the western delta, Libyan groups encountered no serious resistance. Tribes like the Meshwesh and, to a lesser extent, the Labu gradually migrated into Lower Egypt, where they became a disruptive presence among the local population. As warriors, Libyan tribesmen impressed the Egyptians and were accepted as mercenaries. The leader of the Meshwesh eventually settled in Heraklepolis, a city that had served as a military base since Ramesside times, and took command of the armed forces. Though this move was not a formal coup, Shoshank's position as both head of the Meshwesh and top military leader paved the way for his rise to the throne after the death of Suzenz. Around 931 BC, this marked the beginning of the Libyan 22nd dynasty. With its capital at Tanis in the northeastern delta, despite their reputation as fierce fighters, the Libyan rulers rarely governed with strength or efficiency. They remained somewhat separate from Egyptian society, living on its margins and retaining their own names and likely their own language. Libyan soldiers were granted land as a means of support and probably owed feudal-style loyalty to their tribal leaders. Though they adopted Egyptian gods and intermarried with Egyptians at higher social levels, the Libyans continued to be viewed as outsiders, foreign and somewhat uncivilized. The Libyans' poor reputation was only made worse by how they treated Thebes. Although the Thebaid was spared direct Libyan occupation since the Mahaswin tribe, which had pushed southward during the 20th dynasty, soon vanished, the region still watched helplessly as its influence drained away and control of the high priesthood of Amun fell into Libyan hands. Typically, the high priest was a prince from the ruling 22nd dynasty, but many of them didn't even bother to reside in Thebes. Instead, they lived at the fortress in Tena in Middle Egypt, showing up in Thebes only for major religious festivals. Meanwhile, royal inspectors and tax collectors from the north roamed freely in Theban affairs, unchecked and unchallenged. After the dynasty's founder, there was almost no royal construction permitted in Thebes. A few local priests who rose to prominence dared to enclose their names in cartouches, likely imitating the earlier example of Herihor. However, these gestures led to no actual breakaway dynasty. The Libyan kings were known for their tempers, and anyone who opposed them could expect harsh consequences. After a century under Libyan rule, the grievances in Thebes had built up to a breaking point. Pharaoh Osorkon II may have sensed the growing unrest. During his Sed festival in his 22nd year, around 845 BC, he issued a proclamation meant to appease Thebes. "I have exempted Thebes entirely. It is purified and returned to its true lord Amun. No royal inspectors shall interfere, and its people are freed for all time." But the gesture came too late. 17 years later, Thebes erupted in open rebellion against the reviled foreign rulers in the north. It was the third time in Egypt's history that the Thebaid had taken the lead in a nationalist uprising to overthrow a usurping power. Earlier revolts during the 11th dynasty in the 21st century BC and the 17th dynasty in the 16th century BC had succeeded in reunifying the country. No doubt the Theban rebels of 832 BC hoped for a similar victory. The revolt was sudden and fierce. Contemporary accounts noted that it had come without warning signs or omens. Soon the rebellion spread, and much of Upper Egypt had taken up arms against the king in Tanis. The uprising was accompanied by acts of vandalism. Temples and monuments associated with Libyan rule were defaced or destroyed. Theban scribes went so far as to destroy records and documents, aiming to disrupt the Libyan administration. Tefnakht II, the reigning monarch, responded quickly but without much skill or control. He assigned the task of crushing the rebellion to his brother Osorkon, the high priest of Amun, who had remained based in Tena. With military support, Osorkon marched south, defeated the rebels, and re-entered Thebes without opposition. He then tried to restore order, though he issued 6 decrees to increase offerings and granted immunity charters to local institutions. Osorkon could not resist inflicting brutal punishment. The scribes and officials deemed responsible for the revolt were rounded up and burned alive, an act of retribution. As cruel as it was final, these harsh measures did little to solve the underlying issues. Just 4 years later, the southern revolt reignited and lasted for nearly a decade, this time sweeping across much of Egypt. Although the outcome remains unclear, Osorkon's account is biased and vague, clearly meant to present him in a favorable light. It appears that neither side emerged victorious. The Libyan dynasty remained in place, but Thebes was never fully subdued. In the aftermath, Libyan authority steadily declined and fragmented. The long 52-year reign of the ineffective Shishonq III, which covered the first third of the 8th century BC, saw the rise of independent delta regions. These areas were increasingly controlled by local leaders known as Great Chiefs of the Meshwesh. At the same time, rulers in 4 major cities across the Delta and Middle Egypt began to claim royal titles for themselves. The Libyan status as outsiders, combined with practical political needs and long-standing traditions, led to a shift in how kingship was understood. The idea of a single sovereign ruler gave way to a system in which multiple kings, each bearing the title of Ns. These local monarchs did not wage war against one another or against the reigning king in Tanis. Instead, they maintained a fragile balance of power, each dating events according to his own regnal years. Still, this political fragmentation fostered a growing provincialism. Local cultures became more inward-looking, with a stronger emphasis on regional religious practices and tighter bonds between local rulers and their respective nome deities, ***, from the perspective of the young Nubian kingdom, the situation unfolding. In Egypt, their ancestral homeland to the north was deeply disturbing. What they saw was not a land of reverence and divine order, but a chaotic and corrupted version of its former self. The devout traditions of the new kingdom had vanished. In their place stood a nation diluted by foreign influence, stripped of its fear of the gods and respect for sacred law. To the Nubians, Egypt had become a nation of mixed blood and moral decay, tainted by the presence of impious outsiders. The people no longer upheld the principles of divine kingship, nor did they care about being chosen by the gods. They were ignorant of how to serve the divine properly, and this ignorance didn't seem to trouble them at all. They broke religious laws in their everyday lives. Some even wore wool and ate fish, both taboo in the eyes of the devout. Around 737 BC, Kashta was succeeded on the throne of Napata by his son, known as Piankhy or possibly Pia, while earlier rulers like Alara and Kashta remain shadowy figures in the historical record. Piankhy emerges with a vivid and clearly defined character. This is due largely to the extensive and rhetorically powerful inscriptions he left behind, which offer a detailed portrayal of his reign and beliefs. ***, despite its rebellion, Thebes and the cult of Amun continued to play a significant role in the political landscape of the 8th century BC. Although it had failed to shake off Libyan control, Thebes, through its determined resistance, had severely weakened the 22nd dynasty and contributed to the fragmentation of Middle Egypt and the Delta. This made Thebes a power that others could not afford to ignore. In response, northern rulers and local chiefs sought to win its favor. One way they did this was by reviving an earlier custom from the 22nd dynasty, sending daughters to Thebes to serve in the priesthood of Amun as songstresses or ritual attendants. These girls were likely very young when they were dedicated, and their arrival was usually accompanied by financial gifts or political concessions, an effort to gain the goodwill of a city that had forced itself back into national consciousness. Ironically, although the Amun priesthood had lost much of its real power, it now found itself in a position to decide which northern ruler would be officially recognized in temple inscriptions. As a result, we find the names of various kings, some legitimate, others barely known, recorded in association with religious ceremonies or commemorative statues. Sometimes it was the reigning king of the 22nd dynasty, other times a little-known ruler from Letopelos, or a figure like Thotemhat of Hermopolis or even Harses, whose origins remain unclear. As the century progressed, Thebes showed a particular preference for one northern dynasty above the rest, the line of King Pedabast and his descendants. Pedabast, whose name suggests a Bubastite origin, led a dynasty that would later be designated the 23rd by the priest historian. Manetho, however, the geographical reach and political base of this dynasty are still not fully understood. Manetho claimed Tanis as their origin, but excavations at that site have revealed little evidence of Pedabast or his successors. One passage from the Piankhy Stela suggests that around 717 BC, the dynasty's center of power may have been in Bubastis, with influence stretching northeast to Ranipher, west of Tanis. Still, it's uncertain whether this held true in earlier generations. The burial of a queen mother possibly linked to the 23rd dynasty at Tel Mokdem, ancient Leontopolis, has drawn attention to that location, raising the possibility that Bubastis and Tel Mokdem formed a political alliance or axis in the 8th century. Pedabast is indeed attested at Bubastis, though so are other figures from the waning 22nd dynasty, such as Pemu and Shoshank IV. The inscription that mentions Pedabast might be interpreted as reluctant or ambiguous support for his rule. Pedabast and his descendants are somewhat better documented in Thebes. Not long after taking power, Pedabast was officially recognized by the priests of Amun, and his regnal years began to replace those of the 22nd dynasty for dating events. Among his contributions to the city, Pedabast undertook the restoration of the 10th pylon on the southern side of the Amun temple complex, constructing a grand sandstone gateway to replace what had fallen into disrepair, **** elsewhere in the temple. Precinct, Osorkon III, one of Pedabast's successors, built a structure near the approach to the temple of Khonsu. Its purpose remains unclear, possibly a porch, and the reliefs depict Osorkon alongside his son Tefnakht, who was serving as high priest at the time. Later in his reign, Osorkon officially elevated Tefnakht as co-ruler. This co-regency was commemorated in a modest yet elegant shrine to Osiris located northeast of the main Amun temple, which Osorkon built soon after. Pedabast also appears to have employed prominent Theban officials in his administration, which, based on contemporary descriptions, seemed broad in scope and relatively well organized. One of the most notable was Hori, described with elaborate titles such as Hereditary Prince, Sole Friend, and Fan-Bearer on the King's right hand. He held priestly roles in the service of Amun, Montu, and Napata, and served as Pedabast's chief scribe and official correspondent. His responsibilities even included conducting an inspection of the kingdom's economic conditions. In an autobiographical account, Hori presents himself as a trusted advisor and powerful administrator. He claims to have guided the king, brought order to the two lands, Upper and Lower Egypt, and ensured the smooth running of the government. He speaks of being beloved by the king, reporting directly on national labor matters, issuing commands to the people while nobles remained silent, and reviving Egypt's traditions and legal systems. According to his own words, he was sent by the king to assess the condition of the entire country and restore it to order, assigning everyone to their proper role. While Hori's narrative is clearly self-glorifying, the core of the story is clear. Early in the 8th century, as the weakened rule of Sheshonq III of the 22nd dynasty faded and Egypt descended into disorder following the Theban uprising, Pedabast took the opportunity to expand his influence. To do this, he ordered a kingdom-wide census and administrative survey, and to accomplish it, he turned to a well-regarded Theban official. Osorkon III maintained the strong ties with Thebes established by his predecessors. One of his key officials, Jekhonsfink, fourth prophet of Amun and overseer of the treasury of Amun, describes himself as someone trusted by Horus in his house, one who re-established borders and restored what had fallen into disrepair, who organized levies within the temples. He portrays a particularly close relationship with the king. When I was in the palace, I prospered there. I would enter first and leave last, discussing all matters of policy to guide him correctly. I understood the temples, redefined their boundaries, and secured their incomes. I spoke with His Majesty daily. While other officials said only what pleased him, I was unafraid to speak plainly. I calmed him when his temper flared, and he was satisfied with my words. I also brought him tribute from across the land. These remarks suggest Jekhonsfink had daily access to the king and was based entirely in Thebes. This supports the idea that Osorkon III himself resided there. In fact, Osorkon appears to have had a tomb built for himself on Thebes' west bank, and both his titles and artistic depictions connect him strongly to Upper Egypt, despite this evidence of real political involvement. The 23rd dynasty might have faded into obscurity if not for a significant development. Osorkon III's appointment of his daughter Shepenwepet as divine worshipper of Amun. This role, typically filled by a female royal, often a queen, was essentially that of a high priestess overseeing the women serving in Amun's cult. Though the position had existed since before the New Kingdom, it had never held major influence, always overshadowed by the powerful male clergy under the Libyan rulers. There's little record of this office, though a woman named Koromehu's name appears in a cartouche is known to have held it in the 9th century during the time of the high priest and king Harses. But under Osorkon III, Shepenwepet, I transformed the role into one of real political power. She bore a double cartouche and royal-style epithets, such as God's wife of Amun, she who clings to the heart of Amun, beloved of Mut Shepenwepet, living in truth, reborn daily like Re. Shepenwepet even appears before her father in the first two rooms of the Temple of Osiris, making offerings to Amun, Re-Harakti, Ptah, and her royal ancestors. She is depicted being nursed by Hathor and wears the rare honor of two double crown symbols of supreme religious and political authority, asterisk. Osorkon's appointment of his daughter likely occurred shortly after his 23rd regnal year and was part of a larger political arrangement. As part of this plan, his son Tefnakht III was elevated to co-ruler. Iconography and inscriptions related to Tefnakht in the Temple of Osiris reflect a northern, Lower Egyptian influence, suggesting that he served as Osorkon's co-regent in the delta, possibly at Bubastis. Meanwhile, the south was entrusted to Shepenwepet, who held a ceremonial role akin to a queen, alongside the obscure figure of Amun-Rud, who may have been her brother. Looking back, it's hard to believe that this arrangement ever stood a real chance of unifying Egypt. The final ruler of the 22nd dynasty, Sheshonq IV, though nominally recognized in Memphis, had little real authority outside of Tanis, his capital. Thebes entirely disregarded him. While his regnal years were occasionally acknowledged in official records, his name was pointedly excluded from major commemorative inscriptions, a clear sign of disrespect. In the Delta, the powerful local rulers known as the Great Chiefs of the Me maintained control over their respective territories and seemed largely uninterested in national politics. Although Tefnakht III might later have been revered by 7th-century elites as a noble ancestor, he made little tangible impact on Egypt's political scene. Unfortunately for Egypt, this lack of centralized power coincided with the dramatic rise of Assyria under its dynamic ruler Tiglath-Pileser III. In the west, Assyrian expansion meant the conquest and annexation of major buffer states like Arpad and Damascus, and the reduction of the territories held by surviving states in southern Palestine, such as Israel, Ashkelon, and Gaza, over the next century. These weakened states were expected to serve as intermediaries between Egypt and Assyria, a role they frequently failed to fulfill. The Assyrians, however, sought direct engagement with Egypt. After the fall of Gaza around 732 BCE, Assyrian forces advanced to the Brook of Egypt, establishing victory monuments in the region. A local tribal leader was appointed to monitor Egypt's frontier on behalf of Assyria, and strict restrictions were placed on Phoenician timber merchants, forbidding them from trading with either the Philistines or the Egyptians. All of this could be seen as a direct insult to a weakened Egyptian state, which seemed too feeble to respond. Yet, a reaction did come, one that would deeply shape Egyptian history for the next 4 centuries. Sometime shortly after 730 BCE, a Libyan leader named Tefnakht emerged in the western part of the Delta in a region known as the West. In a somewhat murky move, he ousted Ankhur, the legitimate chief of the Labu, from his position in the city of Sais and took control himself. From there, he expanded his power to the cities of Buto in the north and Nemu in the south, uniting these 3 centers into what became known as the Kingdom of the West. By the 36th regnal year of Sheshonq IV, 728 BCE, Tefnakht had already adopted an impressive list of titles, including Great Chief and Commander, Great Chief of the Labu, Prophet of Neith Ajo, and the Mistress of Yamu. Just 4 years later, following the death of Sheshonq IV, who appears to have left no heir, the 22nd dynasty came to an end after nearly 2 centuries of rule. During that same year, Tefnakht began work on a commemorative stela, though the project was never completed. The cartouches were left blank, and the inscription abruptly stops mid-sentence. This interruption may signal a turning point, as Tefnakht declared himself ruler and began dating official documents according to his own reign, effectively claiming kingship. Exactly how Tefnakht managed to rise so quickly to dominance in Lower Egypt remains unclear, but by the time Sheshonq died, he had already become a well-known figure. His sphere of influence stretched across the western delta. From Memphis to the Mediterranean Sea, many of the major local chiefs and the ruling Families of various royal cities accepted his authority. These included Akinish in the Sebennytic region near the central Nile, though he may have done so reluctantly. Chief Shashank of Busiris, likely a distant relative of the last 22nd dynasty ruler. Chief Dedemunfank of Mendes, descended from the long-standing Hornict family. And Prince Piankhy of Athribis, a great-grandson of Sheshank III, even King Upet of Leontopolis and King Osorkon IV of the 23rd dynasty, who ruled in Bubastis and Ranof, appear to have submitted to Tefnakht's authority. Their compliance, despite their own royal ambitions, may reflect Tefnakht's aggressive rise to power and his strong leadership. None of these regional rulers, entrenched in their local interests, stepped forward to claim national leadership after the fall of the 22nd dynasty. Tefnakht's growing fame and early victories seem to affirm Egypt's lingering potential even after centuries of stagnation. The memory of Egypt's power during the New Kingdom remained vivid across Western Asia, where tales of its mighty pharaohs were still told, though often in distorted forms. Observers who saw through the facade and recognized Egypt's underlying weakness in the post-New Kingdom era had few supporters, and the warnings of figures like Hosea or Isaiah went largely unheeded, with the Assyrian threat looming in Tefnakht. Viewed as a potential savior, it's no surprise that the remaining city-states of the southern Levant turned to Egypt for help. In 724 BCE, Israel, by then reduced to little more than the city of Samaria, sent emissaries to Sais and launched a rebellion against Assyria in hopes of gaining Egyptian military support. But Assyria responded swiftly. Shalmaneser V, successor to Tiglath-Pileser III, led his forces west and laid siege to Samaria. Before Tefnakht could intervene, King Hoshea of Israel was captured in early 722 BCE, and Samaria fell that September. Over 27,000 of its residents were deported. Shalmaneser died before the year's end, and Tefnakht seized the opportunity presented by the power shift in Assyria to act. He aligned himself with Hanno, the former king of Gaza, who had fled to Egypt a decade earlier to escape Assyrian conquest. Together they formed an alliance, and Hanno launched a revolt in Gaza. At the same time, uprisings flared in central Syria. The rebellion lasted 2 years until Sargon II, the new king of Assyria, turned his focus westward in 720 BCE and advanced into Syria. The resistance collapsed, and Sargon continued his march toward Gaza. This time, Egypt responded. Tefnakht assembled an army under the command of a general named Rhea and sent it to Rapihu, modern-day Raphia, just south of Gaza, where Hanno had gathered his Philistine forces. Sargon himself later recounted the battle. Hanno, king of Gaza, and Sib, the Egyptian commander, came out from Rapihu to confront me in battle. I defeated them. Sib fled in fear as soon as he heard the sound of my army approaching, and was never seen again. I personally captured Hanno. I then received tribute from Pyre of Egypt, from Samsi, queen of Arabia, and from Itamar the Sabaean, gold dust, horses, and camels. When writing the history of Egypt's foreign affairs between roughly 900 and 525 BCE, it's important to remember that much of the surviving documentation comes from sources outside Egypt. The battle at Raphia highlights the challenges this presents to historians. If Sargon's victory had truly been as decisive as he claimed, why didn't he continue his advance at a leisurely pace if necessary and subdue the delta towns one by one? The events that followed suggest that Sargon may have exaggerated the scale of his success. Although the battle was clearly a setback for the forces of Hanno and Rhea, it was not the total triumph that his account implied. In Egypt, Tefnakht's standing was barely affected. Between 719 and 718 BCE, he began consolidating and expanding his power in the Delta region. While his critics may have mocked his followers as dogs at his heels, such ridicule might just as easily have been aimed at the supporters of Egypt's earlier, now celebrated dynasties. The truth is, recent setbacks had not diminished Tefnakht's influence. Instead, he turned his attention toward Egyptian regions not yet under his control. With Memphis already in his hands, his next goal was Middle Egypt. Tefnakht's campaign southward was a show of strength. of the two minor kingdoms that held sway over Middle Egypt from Asiyut to Memphis Namlet of Hermopolis, aligned himself with Tefnakht. However, Pefjawabast of Heraclepolis refused to do the same. Despite this resistance, nearly all of Pefjawabast's fortresses, aside from his capital, surrendered to Tefnakht on both banks of the Nile. Tefnakht traveled through the region, moving up the Behr Youssef Canal and returning down the Nile to solidify his control. He then launched a siege against Heraclepolis itself. In desperation, Pefjawabast sent out pleas for assistance. Carried by the few still brave enough to defy the growing power of the Delta, this call for help would soon set in motion a series of events that would shape the next chapter of Egyptian history. ***, the exact date of Osorkon III's death remains uncertain, but it likely occurred before Tefnakht rose to prominence, probably around 730 BCE or earlier. When the old king was laid to rest in his tomb west of Thebes, he left behind a vulnerable Thebaid under the leadership of descendants too weak to provide real protection. Tefnakht III, who was likely stationed in the north, did not outlive him. By much, in Thebes itself, another of Osorkon's sons, Amun, is mentioned in minor inscriptions. He lived long enough to father at least two daughters, one who married King Pefjawabast of Heraclepolis and another who became a singer of Amun and was buried at Medinet Hebu. Amun himself did not remain in power for long, though the exact details of his end are unknown. With Amun's disappearance, Libyan rule over the Thebaid effectively came to an end. Shortly afterward, in what appears to have been a peaceful and unopposed transition, the Kushite king Piankhy extended his authority over Thebes rather than resist his arrival. The people of Thebes welcomed this southern dark-skinned ruler who shared their deep devotion to Amun and honored their city. Piankhy installed a military garrison in Thebes, led by generals Porum and Lamersigny, but their presence was not oppressive. No officials appointed by the previous 23rd dynasty were removed from office. Even Shepenwepet I, the divine worshipper and a member of the former royal family, was allowed to remain in her position, continuing to enjoy the respect and recognition befitting a symbolic head of state. However, Piankhy did require her to make a key concession, one that would set a lasting precedent for centuries. She was obliged to adopt his younger sister, Amidst, as her daughter and designated successor in the role of divine worshipper. Both women were honored on public monuments with royal titles and regalia, with Shepenwepet maintaining only slight seniority over her Kushite apprentice. This clever arrangement gave Piankhy a firm hold over Thebes. Through Amidst, who symbolized Kushite interests and the military leadership of his generals, he ensured tight control over the Thebaid. It was from this region, now willingly aligned with Nubian rule, that the pleas for help from northern Egypt were passed on to Piankhy. ***, our main source for the dramatic events that followed comes from a large granite stela discovered in 1862 among the ruins of the Temple of Amun at Napata, now housed in the Cairo Museum. The stela is inscribed with 159 lines across its front and sides, topped with a vivid depiction of various dignitaries paying homage to the king. The text is a remarkably skillful attempt to use classical Egyptian, showing only minimal influence from the contemporary spoken language. It demonstrates just how far the Sudanese administration had advanced since the days of Alara, especially in their ability to employ educated Egyptian scribes. Although few Nubians of the time would have been able to read the text, the scribe responsible created a well-structured and rhetorically sophisticated narrative. He even included archaic expressions to emphasize his learning. Still, it's important not to assume he worked freely. Every element of the stela carefully serves the interests of the king. Piankhy, who spoke a different language, clearly supervised the creation of this record to project a specific royal image. Each part of the story, whether dramatic or subtle, is used to highlight aspects of the king's character. In fact, the inscription reads less like a formal record and more like a crafted story. It's not a typical chronicle or set of annals, it's a deliberate narrative meant to communicate a message through this account. We see a portrait of Piankhy exactly as he wanted to be remembered, bold, confident, and unshaken in the face of foreign threats, an uncompromising defender of divine will. He presents himself as a purist, outraged by the spiritual and moral decay of Egypt. His behavior and values stand in stark contrast to the corruption around him, positioning him as the righteous instrument of Amun's justice. Even in small things, his conduct speaks volumes. He instructs his soldiers on how to behave as respectful guests in Thebes, emphasizing purity and reverence. Only Amun deserves their worship. Only in his temple must they be unarmed and spiritually clean. Victory, he insists, comes solely from Amun. Piankhy follows strict dietary rules and keeps himself separate from women, traits that underscore his piety and discipline. Even though the motives behind the stela are clearly self-serving, there's little reason to doubt the general accuracy of the events it describes. While Piankhy's reasons for acting may have been idealized in the text, the actual events seem credible. His decision to intervene was clearly a response to Tefnakt's push into Middle Egypt, though the delay may have come from underestimating the threat, rather than the supreme confidence in himself and Amun that the text suggests. What truly pushed Piankhy to act was Hermopolis publicly siding with Tefnakht. At that moment, he ordered his garrison commanders in Egypt to immediately lay siege to Hermopolis, while also sending reinforcements from Napata. Somewhere along the Nile between Thebes and Asayat, the Kushite army encountered and defeated a rapid response force sent by Tefnakht. The next day, they wiped out the remnants of the fleeing troops across the river. This victory was seen as a major setback by Tefnakt's northern allies. Namlite, who had been part of the siege of Heraclepolis, quickly abandoned the effort and rushed back to Hermopolis, just ahead of the Nubian forces who soon surrounded the city. At this point, Piankhy's commanders, especially Porum, demonstrated real military skill. While keeping Hermopolis under siege, they launched a swift surprise attack down the Bear Yusuf and captured Oxyrhynchos. This clever move forced other rebel-held forts loyal to Heraclepolis to shut their gates and prepare for sieges of their own. The Kushite army was well equipped. They used battering rams against the city of Tefnakht, capturing it after heavy fighting and causing significant casualties, including one of Tefnakt's sons, likely stationed there as commander. The victory sent a strong message, and the nearby town of Heya Boynu, modern Sharuna, surrendered without resistance. These rapid victories sealed Tefnakt's fate, even if the stela continues for another 130 lines, mostly to glorify Piankhy. The text paints him as dissatisfied with his general's performance and slowly making his way north, not out of urgency, but so he could properly honor Amun and finish the mission himself. When Hermopolis surrendered, he personally received it and even expressed outrage over the poor treatment of Namlite's horses. As if he were an ancient version of an animal rights advocate, he then accepted tribute from Pheftawabist, the very ruler whose city he had come to protect. Pheftawabist bowed before him, pledged loyalty, and agreed to pay annual taxes. Piankhy, in turn, graciously accepted, adding a final touch of royal generosity to his carefully curated image.